I remember the sound first, the kind of silence that doesn't arrive all at once, but leaks slowly into a place. The crowd gone, the echo fading under the bleachers. Only the wind carrying the ghost of a whistle across a field that once mattered. You can almost hear the old leather cleats on mud that's hardened overnight. The smell of turf and liniment still hanging in the air. That's where the game really lived in. The hours after it ended, when the plays were gone and the men who made them stood alone in their thoughts, guarding secrets that no one would ever film. Long before television turned football into choreography, it was closer to folklore. Plays weren't diagrams on a broadcast screen. They were whispered inventions, drawn in dirt and memory. Each town, each coach, each team had its own dialect. Play could be born on a chalkboard in Canton and die in a locker room in Green Bay. Unrecorded, unremembered. What we lost when the camera arrived wasn't just privacy, was imagination. I once met a man who claimed to have the last original playbook of the Rock Island independence. He said it was written in fountain pen on yellowed paper, every page smudged with sweat. He'd found it in an old trunk his grandfather left behind. Inside were plays no one had ever seen, a goth balance lines, cross-motion traps, laterals disguised as fumbles. He didn't know how to read all of them, but he knew they meant something. These, he told me, were the plays before the world started watching. In that sentence was an entire era. Before the lights, before the national anthem broadcast to living rooms, before slow motion made heroes immortal, football lived in secrecy. It was a game of coded gestures and whispered instructions. The sideline was a border between invention and exposure, and every coach was both a teacher and a gatekeeper. The fans saw the violence and glory. But the strategy, the true soul of the game, belonged only to those who stood within the huddle. The early NFL was a different kind of wilderness. There were no highlight reels, no film rooms dissecting every angle. What happened on Sunday existed only in the memories of those who were there. Teams guarded their playbooks like family heirlooms. Formations were not yet standardized. Terminology was local and fluid. The same play might be called Red Right in Ohio, Box 22 in Chicago, and Buck Lateral 3 in Pennsylvania, and each would unfold in its own peculiar rhythm. To an outsider, it looked like chaos. To those inside, it was art. But that art was fragile. In the 1920s and 1930s, football was a laboratory without cameras. Coaches like George Halas, Curly Lambeau, and Potsy Clark experimented freely, combining rugby roots with evolving American aggression. The single wing, the double wing, the box, they were more than formations. They were philosophies. Every practice was a test of human geometry. Every game, a new proof in a living equation. Yet these experiments left few records. When teams folded, their notebooks vanished. When players retired, their knowledge died with them. There's a photograph of a team in Akron, 1925. 11 men, mud to their knees, faces half hidden under leather helmets. None of their names are famous. But what they carried in their heads, how to angle a block, how to sell a fake handoff, became the uncredited DNA of every play that came after. We celebrate the game's modern architects, but the original blueprints were drafted in places no one filmed, no one archived. The history of football strategy isn't a straight line, it's a palimpsest, layered over with each generation's memory and loss. When television arrived in the 1950s, it promised to immortalize the sport. And in many ways, it did. The camera preserved greatness, allowed ordinary fans to see the field from above, to understand the structure beneath the chaos. But in capturing football, television also froze it. Plays once alive in improvisation became standardized patterns. The camera favored formations that looked good from a wide angle, plays that unfolded cleanly for the viewer. Complexity had to translate to clarity. What didn't translate disappeared. I often wonder what was lost in that translation. Before television, strategy was local. Teams adjusted not for ratings, but for rain, mud, the curve of a baseball infield under their cleats. Coaches built playbooks around their personnel, their fields, their opponents. They hid signals under towels, changed terminology weekly, sometimes daily. There was a pride in secrecy, a sense that the real contest wasn't between players, but between minds. You didn't just beat an opponent. You outthought him, outremembered him. You carried the game in your head, like contraband. When television came, the game became communal. Plays were replayed, analyzed, and named by commentators. A nation learned to see football not as a conversation among the few, but as a spectacle for the many. It was the birth of the common language: sweep, draw, blitz, screen. The words we use now to describe football were once the guarded code of insiders. The moment they became public, the mystery began to fade. Imagine being one of those old coaches in 1955, standing on the sideline as the camera crew set up. You'd spent your life hiding the details, motions, unspoken coups on. Suddenly, your work was about to be televised to every rival in America. Every habit you trained your men to conceal would soon become replay material. For some, it was a kind of betrayal. For others, a new challenge to evolve faster than the broadcast could explain them. The shift was cultural, not just technical. Football moved from the field to the living room. It became entertainment, product, national rhythm. But something quiet was lost in the transition: the intimacy between coach and player. The creative privacy that made every week a reinvention. Plays became intellectual property, commodified diagrams traded in coaching clinics and media packages. The very strategies once whispered in locker rooms were printed in newspapers and later animated on screens. There's a forgotten story of a coach anonymous in most archives who, after his team folded in the late 1930s, burned his playbooks in a metal barrel behind the fieldhouse. When asked why, he said, "These plays don't belong to strangers. They were for the men who knew how to run them." His reasoning was simple. A play had no meaning outside its living context. Without the voice that called it, without the sweat and dust that gave it shape, it was just ink. The television age couldn't understand that. It turned every play into spectacle, stripped from the private ecosystem that gave it purpose. Every time I read an old game account, a paragraph or two buried in a yellowing newspaper, I feel the ache of that disappearance. The reporter might mention a clever lateral sequence or a deceptive shift to the right, but never the full design. Those fragments are all we have. The rest exists only in conjecture, in the muscle memory of players long gone. When we watch football now, we see patterns of repetition, plays that echo those ancient designs. But the language has been simplified, standardized, rebranded for modern speed. It's efficient, it's global, but it's not mysterious. What was once guarded knowledge is now broadcast in ultra-high definition, slowed down, decoded, consumed. And yet, beneath that clarity, something still moves the shadow of forgotten plays. The whisper of men who once invented the game every Sunday from scratch. I can't help but think of that empty field again, the one after the crowd is gone. The air is cold, the scoreboard dead, the stadium reduced to steel and silence. Somewhere under the grass lies the memory of a formation no one remembers, a pattern that once fooled a defense, a moment that changed nothing and everything. No film captured it. No diagram survived it. But in that forgotten motion lived the purest form of football, the one not yet performed for cameras, not yet translated into commentary. That's where this story begins. Before the replays, before the commentators, before the bright polish of the televised age, there was a game built on memory, on secrecy, on a kind of beauty that could vanish the moment the whistle blew. The story of the NFL's forgotten plays is not just about tactics. It's about a culture that existed before the lens. It's about strategy as language, as poetry, as identity. And it's about what we lost when football stopped being something you had to be there to see. The silence after the crowd fades isn't empty, it's full of echoes. You can almost hear them now, a quarterback calling an audacious fake, a lineman shifting his stance, a coach muttering a phrase no one else will understand. Those moments didn't make it to film, but they made the game what it became. And in remembering them, we might understand the sport not as spectacle, but as craft and art form born in secrecy and sustained by imagination. This is the story of the plays no one ever saw, and the men who created them before the world was watching. The past is not silent. It hums beneath the surface, beneath the roar of modern stadiums, beneath the endless analysis of televised pundits, beneath every instant replay dissected in slow motion. Before football became a broadcast ritual, before the league learned to choreograph its own mythology, the game was a secret craft practiced in fragments of light and shadow. What survives of that era are the brittle pages of playbooks, the fading recollections of old men who coached in wool overcoats, and the brittle columns of local newspapers that struggled to describe what their eyes barely understood. When the National Football League was founded in 1920, it was not the empire it would become. It was a loose confederation of small-town clubs, most without permanent stadiums, each one fighting to stay solvent. Players were local mill workers, factory hands, part-time athletes paid a few dollars per game. There were no national broadcasts, no film crews charting every formation, no microphones capturing a coach's voice. Strategy, in those years, lived only in speech and memory. A play was born on a chalkboard and died when the last man who ran it was gone. I began tracing this history not through highlight reels, but through the quiet corridors of archives. In a university basement in Canton, Ohio, I held a 1932 playbook from the Chicago Bears, its pages stained with dirt and sweat. The formations looked nothing like modern diagrams. Players bunched tightly, arrows crossing in chaotic knots, handwritten notes in the margin like, "Decoy, don't show motion until last count." In those scribbles, I could feel a world before television, a time when secrecy was survival. Coaches protected their playbooks like state documents. Teams rarely shared film. If you wanted to learn an opponent's system, you sent someone to watch from the stands, pretending to be a fan. The rules themselves were still in flux. Forward passing had only recently become legal, and even then, it was a weapon of last resort. The single wing dominated the field, a swirling mass of misdirection built on deception and brute timing. From that formation emerged the Notre Dame Box, a more balanced but equally deceptive system that demanded every player disguise intent until the last possible instant. Offenses looked like sleight of hand routines. Linemen sold fakes with their bodies. Backs hid the ball under thick leather pads. And quarterbacks, who in those days were rarely the central stars, became conductors of illusion. The absence of cameras gave these men freedom. They could experiment in obscurity. Plays evolved like whispered dialects, each team inventing its own grammar. When we speak of the language of football today, we forget how literal that phrase once was. Coaches developed private codes, signals exchanged under breath, entire terminologies that existed only within a locker room. There were no rulebooks for style. There were no film studies breaking down tendencies. Each game was a mystery until it began. To reconstruct that lost world, this documentary draws from the surviving evidence. Handwritten playbooks from teams like the Bears, Packers, and Giants, oral histories from coaches' descendants, and newspaper accounts that captured, often clumsily, the rhythm of early strategy. I've read George Halas's reflections on his formative years, how he learned to adapt the single wing to suit his personnel, long before the T formation made him a legend. I've studied Curly Lambeau's recollections of experimenting with lateral plays on frozen fields in Green Bay, chasing any edge in a game that rewarded secrecy. I've listened to archivists who still find scrapbooks filled with sketches of forgotten plays, half-legible diagrams that once decided championships few remember. The promise of this series is simple but immense. to restore the memory of strategies that existed before the camera defined what football looked like. We will move decade by decade, formation by formation, exploring how innovation was born not from fame, but from necessity. This is not a story of highlights, but of invention, the kind that thrives only in darkness. Across 15 chapters, we will trace this evolution from the birth of professional play through the dawn of televised football. We begin with the tactical foundations, the single wing and its deceptive power, the Notre Dame box that refined it, and the T formation that ultimately rewrote offensive philosophy. From there, we'll examine the rise of special teams tricks, the hidden ball, and sleeper. Plays that could only exist before referees had cameras to catch them. We'll explore the underground economy of scouting, where coaches employed informants and spies long before film study made tendencies public. We'll dive into defensive revolutions, the seven-man fronts, the early zone concepts, and the first signs of the blitz. We'll also uncover the human texture of this history. The coaches who built their reputations on secrecy, like Halas and Lambeau, were men who viewed innovation as property. Clark Shaughnessy, whose analytical mind helped modernize the T formation, saw his ideas replicated overnight, spreading faster than he could control. There were the forgotten assistants, the playbook secretaries, the part-time trainers who stored diagrams in shoeboxes long after the teams had folded. These people, too, were guardians of a lost lexicon, a language that would later vanish beneath the bright lights of televised standardization. Television's arrival in the 1950s changed the game forever. Suddenly, football had to be legible. Plays were no longer secrets, they were spectacles, replayed, diagrammed, and explained to millions. Formations that once belonged to a single team became public property. Trick plays dwindled as cameras exposed their timing. Coaches began designing systems not just for victory, but for visibility. The sport entered an age of mass interpretation, where the art of deception slowly gave way to the science of entertainment. This documentary exists to trace that turning point, to show how the tactical imagination of early football built the foundation for everything that came after, and how much of that imagination disappeared when exposure became the measure of success. In those early decades, a coach's greatest weapon was mystery. The less the opponent knew, the greater the advantage. But once games were filmed, once every angle could be studied and cataloged, the nature of genius itself began to change. The coaches who thrived in secrecy struggled under the lights. The game became predictable, standardized, televised. Yet, for all we've gained in spectacle, we have lost something intimate. The quiet genius of innovation born from necessity. The artistry of deception unrecorded by any lens. Imagine the field at dusk in 1935, a coach whispering to his quarterback, diagramming a play that would vanish after that night. Imagine the crowd, unaware they were witnessing a strategy no one would ever see again. That is the world we are returning to, the forgotten plays that built the modern game's soul. Throughout this series, we will move through 3 layers of storytelling. First, the tactical, the real formations and strategic evolutions that defined early football. Second, the cultural, the lives of the men who invented and guarded these systems. And third, the historical, the forces of technology and media that reshaped the game's essence. We will hear from historians, archivists, and family members of players whose innovations have faded from memory. We will look at the material remains, chalk diagrams, coded notebooks, newspaper sketches, and piece together how ideas moved from one mind to another before they were ever televised. The journey will reveal a paradox. Football's growth depended on secrecy, yet its fame depended on exposure. The same innovations that lifted the sport to national attention ultimately erased the conditions that made innovation possible. Every time the camera turned on, a piece of the game's mystery flickered out. By the time the 1958 NFL Championship, the greatest game ever played, was broadcast to millions, football's hidden age was over. What had once been a language of whispers was now a national script. This series will tell the story of that transformation, not through nostalgia, but through evidence, through the real voices and records of the men who shaped a sport in darkness. We begin where memory still lingers in the early decades. When players called their own signals, coaches scribbled diagrams by lamplight. And every team carried its own private book of magic. Before television made the game visible, football was a secret art, and every secret, eventually, leaves a trace. The field was Montreal mud. Not the manicured slurry of modern stadiums, but the kind that swallowed cleats and carried the smell of wet earth. I remember standing at midfield as the rain thickened, blurring the chalk lines until they disappeared entirely. You couldn't tell where the end zone began. The stands were a collection of soaked hats and smoke rising from wool coats. Somewhere in that murk, a voice called the signal, muffled under the downpour. What happened next would never be filmed, never diagrammed in a coach's clinic, never even written down. It lived for a few seconds, in the breath between snaps. A trick formation that swung a game and then vanished forever. That was professional football in the 1920s, improvised, intimate, and largely invisible. Every contest felt like a secret known only to those who were there. The sport was still finding its rhythm, its shape, its language. There were no broadcast crews, no national press coverage. Strategy existed as rumor. A team in Ohio might develop a blocking scheme that no one outside the county would ever see. A coach in Illinois might invent a new backfield motion, use it once, and lose it forever. Those who played in that era described the game as part science, part survival. The early professional teams, Canton Bulldogs, Rock Island Independents, Dayton Triangles, were organized chaos. They traveled by train, dressed in borrowed locker rooms, and played on fields that doubled as baseball diamonds or cow pastures. The rules were flexible, enforcement inconsistent. Even the ball itself, thicker, rounder, heavier, changed the geometry of play. Passing was possible, but unreliable. Running dominated because it could be trusted. Tactically, early football was built on instinct and adaptation. Playbooks were scarce, often handwritten on scrap paper. Teams carried only a handful of set formations, and most adjustments happened on the field, in the huddle. A quarterback might call a play by describing motion in plain speech. Run left behind Joe, fake toss to Ed. Nothing was standardized. Each team's vocabulary was its own dialect. That fluidity meant creativity thrived. But also, that memory was the only archive. When players retired, they took the playbook with them, stored in the folds of recollection. The coach, in those years, was less a tactician and more a conductor of character. George Halas, then a young player coach for the Decatur Staleys, often told his men to run what works until it doesn't. He believed in repetition, rhythm, and physical will more than in diagrammed sophistication. Curly Lambeau, organizing the Green Bay Packers from a small Wisconsin community, relied on the simple principles of deception: a fake handoff, a delayed run, a surprise kick. These were tools forged in the absence of structure, without film to study or media to critique. The only accountability was the scoreboard and the bruises left behind. The environments themselves dictated strategy. In mud or snow, timing plays were impossible. Coaches learned to adapt to the field, building offensive identities around local climate. Midwest teams, battered by weather, emphasized power formations. Eastern teams, playing on firmer grounds, leaned on misdirection. Every game was a laboratory of circumstance. Tactics weren't portable. They were born from dirt and wind. In 1921, during a game between the Staleys and the Buffalo All-Americans, Halas used what could be called the first professional trick alignment. K. The play, by all accounts, emerged from frustration rather than innovation. The field was soaked, the score low. Halas instructed his backfield to cluster tightly and delay the snap count, creating confusion long enough for his halfback to slip through an unguarded gap. It worked once. Buffalo's defense, expecting a punt, froze. The play wasn't named, wasn't patented, wasn't even repeated. It was a fleeting victory tactics as improvisation. This improvisational nature defined early pro football's beauty and fragility. There were no film rooms to immortalize mistakes or triumphs. Everything depended on observation and oral tradition. Veterans passed knowledge through mentorship, not manuals. A lineman might teach a rookie a leverage technique that had no name but immense effect. Coaches sketched plays in the dirt, revising them mid-game as conditions changed. Each week was a fresh experiment in physical geometry. The lack of consistent officiating also encouraged invention. Without the all-seeing eye of replay or standardized rule enforcement, players stretched boundaries. Hidden ball plays, deceptive laterals, and unorthodox formations were common. Referees could only see so much through the chaos of flying mud. Teams exploited that human limitation. Football in those days was as much about psychology as it was about strength. It's easy now to imagine those players as primitive craftsmen, but that underestimates their sophistication. They were innovators operating under constraint, designing systems in real time. Without cameras, their creativity went undocumented, but not unreal. The absence of oversight made room for brilliance. Every game held the potential for a small tactical revolution that might vanish by sundown. The relationship between players and coaches reflected this volatility. Roles overlapped. Many players doubled as strategists, adjusting formations between downs. Quarterbacks, then more field captains than passing icons, acted as translators of the coach's philosophy. When something failed, it wasn't a schematic flaw, it was a matter of execution or intuition. The culture valued adaptability over theory. The tactical structures that did exist often borrowed from collegiate systems. The single wing had already begun shaping the game, but in the early 1920s, most teams relied on variations of the seven-man line, a brute force arrangement emphasizing physical dominance. Passing lanes were rare. Misdirection and trickery served as equalizers against superior size. Teams without deep rosters compensated with deception, turning strategy into necessity. One surviving artifact from 1923, the Akron prose play, Notes, reveals the simplicity and ingenuity of that era. A single page lists only 12 plays, 6 runs, 4 kicks, 2 passes. Yet each was annotated with situational advice. Use no. 7 on wet ground. Delay snap count to unsettle tackle. Guard shift only if wind favorable. Those marginal notes tell a story of football as a living conversation between environment and intention. Strategy was not abstract, it was visceral. Locality shaped not just tactics, but identity. Teams reflected their regions. The Pottsville Maroons of Pennsylvania were minor sons, favoring heavy-line plunges and relentless inside runs. The Duluth Eskimos, traveling thousands of miles each season, developed endurance-based tactics, long grinding drives to wear opponents down. In Chicago, Hollis's Staley's, soon the Bears, blended deception and power, prefiguring the Midwestern pragmatism that would define the franchise for decades. In those early years, victory depended on resilience and wit more than on preparation. Without reliable film or scouting, teams entered each contest with partial knowledge. Game planning was guesswork. Opponents might switch lineups, hide injuries, or disguise intentions. Coaches sent scouts to watch from the stands, scribbling crude notes about formations glimpsed through the crowd. Every advantage had to be earned through observation. It's difficult to overstate how invisible this world was. Newspapers provided brief accounts, often incorrect. Radio broadcasts were rare and localized. A fan in Boston might never hear of a legendary play in Chicago. Strategy circulated through gossip, not media. That obscurity protected innovation. It also buried it. Plays that worked spectacularly might never be seen again simply because no one outside that field witnessed them. As professional football stabilized through the decade, the seeds of formal strategy began to sprout. Coaches started to codify their systems to create continuity beyond oral tradition. Hollis, Lambeau, and others began maintaining organized notebooks, rudimentary but precious. These early playbooks marked a shift from spontaneous invention to structured thinking. They were the sport's first archives of intelligence, yet even then, secrecy ruled. A lost playbook was a catastrophe. Teams guarded them with intensity, fearing rivals might steal ideas. The early NFL, for all its chaos, was a proving ground for creativity, unmediated by scrutiny. It was a place where a coach could test an unorthodox formation without fear of exposure, where a play could exist purely in the moment. That freedom would not last. As crowds grew, as radio and newsreel cameras arrived, the game's hidden artistry would gradually be forced into the open. But here, in the damp haze of the 1920s, football was still an unseen game of craft, practiced in mud and memory. Each huddle was a council of invention. Each snap, a gamble against the elements. The players were engineers of instinct, sculpting strategy from circumstance. They played for small crowds, smaller paychecks, and a kind of immortality that existed only in the minds of those who saw them. This was the genesis of professional football's tactical soul. A game born in silence, refined through improvisation, and destined to evolve beyond secrecy. But before the floodlights and the cameras, before strategy became a commodity, football belonged to those who could invent it in real time. The next chapter of that evolution would come through structure, the birth of formations designed not merely to survive conditions, but to manipulate them. From improvisation would come geometry. From chaos, order. The crowd barely breathed as the formation shifted, a slow, deliberate motion that meant everything and revealed nothing. The tailback crouched deep behind an unbalanced line, his eyes scanning the defense. The snap came not to him, but to the fullback, who pivoted, hid the ball under his hip, and spun. For an instant, 11 men became shadows in motion. The defense collapsed toward the wrong side, drawn by instinct and confusion. Then, like a curtain lifting, the tailback emerged on the opposite end, sprinting through a gap no one had seen until it was too late. The play gained 20 yards, enough for the title. No replay existed. No camera captured the sleight of hand. All that remained was the whisper that the single wing, once again, had turned deception into dominance. To understand early football's strategic DNA, you have to understand the single wing. It was not just a formation, it was a philosophy, an entire worldview of how to control chaos. Developed in the early 1900s and refined by Glenn "Pop" Warner, the single wing became the backbone of American football for nearly 4 decades. By the 1920s and 1930s, every professional and collegiate powerhouse had its own version. It combined brute force and subtlety, physical punishment and psychological manipulation. It was football's first grand illusion. At its core, the single wing was defined by imbalance. The offensive line shifted heavily to one side, creating what coaches called the strong side. The backfield formed a loose diamond, a tailback deep and slightly offset, a fullback closer to the line, a quarterback core blocking back just behind the guard, and a wingback hovering outside the end. The ball was snapped directly to the tailback or fullback, bypassing the quarterback entirely. That direct snap gave the offense an extra heartbeat of freedom. The defense never knew who had the ball, when it had been snapped, or where the attack would go. This formation weaponized deception through motion and timing. The tailback could pass, run, or hand off to the wingback, circling behind him. The fullback could fake a run into the line, forcing defenders to collapse inward while the play swung wide. The wingback, often the smallest and quickest player on the field, became a ghost, slipping behind blockers or cutting across the backfield to draw coverage. Misdirection wasn't a trick, it was the system's lifeblood. Pop Warner had tested it at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where players like Jim Thorpe transformed it into poetry. But when the professional game embraced it in the 1920s, the single wing evolved into something harder, meaner. George Hollis's Chicago Bears built their identity on it, combining disciplined blocking with relentless deception. Curly Lambeau's Packers refined it with precision, emphasizing timing and spacing. Every coach studied the formation's possibilities, tweaking line splits, backfield motion, and snap counts to suit their personnel. What made the single wing so enduring was its paradoxical nature. It looked chaotic, but functioned on perfect order. Each movement had purpose. Each fake had to sell itself entirely. The unbalanced line created mismatches, extra blockers where defenses least expected them. The spacing forced defenders to hesitate, to question what they saw. A single wrong step could open a seam the offense had been waiting to exploit. In the mud and grit of 1930s football, deception was more than elegance, it was necessity. Passing was unreliable, fields unpredictable. The single wing allowed teams to dictate tempo regardless of conditions. With its power running game, it could grind out yardage in snow or rain. With its layered fakes, it could spring sudden bursts of brilliance when defenses grew complacent. The formation was not static. It breathed with the game's rhythm. Blocking in the single wing was both art and violence. The unbalanced front created leverage advantages that required extraordinary coordination. Guards and tackles pulled across the formation in synchronized motion, leading interference for misdirection runs. The key was timing. If one man hesitated, the illusion collapsed. Coaches drilled their linemen endlessly, choreographing movements like dancers who had to perform in armor. Every man must know where the ghost is, Hallis once said, referring to the ball's hidden path. If he doesn't, the defense will. The backfield, too, was built on discipline. The tailback was the formation's brain, a hybrid of quarterback, running back, and magician. He needed vision, accuracy, and deception in equal measure. The fullback was the hammer, the enforcer who sold the fake and took the punishment. The blocking back, often overlooked, was the pivot, a human hinge, who could lead blocks, throw short passes, or vanish into motion. The wingback was the whisper, the unpredictable element that made defenses chase shadows. Each play began with deception, but its success depended on trust. Players had to believe in their roles, even when they never touched the ball. The best single-wing teams moved like an organism, each man's motion designed to mislead as much as to advance. Secrecy extended beyond the field. Coaches shrouded their playbooks in myth. Practices were closed. Diagrams were coded. Teams feared spies from rival clubs, especially as the sport's popularity grew. Some coaches used pseudonyms for play, simple nouns like Red or Hammer, so that overheard calls revealed nothing. In 1933, during the NFL's first official championship game, the Bears' mastery of the single wing reached its zenith. Facing the New York Giants, Hollis's team unleashed a series of plays that blended deception and brutality. One drive became legendary. The tailback feigned a reverse, handed to the fullback for a line plunge, then on the next down through, from the same alignment to a tight end release downfield. The Giants, conditioned to expect the run, collapsed inward. The pass soared over their heads. The crowd erupted, unaware they had just witnessed the formation's perfect expression. The single wing's dominance endured not because of tradition, but because defenses struggled to solve it. Its angles defied conventional logic. Tackles faced double teams from shifting blockers. Linebackers were forced to guess between illusion and truth. The formation demanded that defenders react, never anticipate. Even as passing began to evolve in the late 1930s, the single wing remained the foundation of most offenses. It taught football how to think three-dimensionally. But every empire faces resistance. As the formation spread, defenses began to adapt. Coaches like Steve Owen of the Giants and Paul Brown of the Cleveland Browns studied the single-winged S patterns, noting that its deception relied on time. Delay could be exploited. By flooding the strong side and forcing quicker decisions, defenses began to compress its freedom. Linebackers were taught to read guard movement rather than the backfield, subtle but revolutionary change. The chess match had begun. The single wing was not merely a playbook. It was a philosophy of concealment. Its success depended on opacity, the idea that truth in football could be hidden in plain sight. Coaches of the era guarded it fiercely. Playbooks were burned or buried when seasons ended. Assistants were sworn to secrecy. The few surviving diagrams from that time are relics of a clandestine craft. Their pencil lines evidence of how seriously these men took their art. When you study those old playbooks today, what strikes you is the balance of logic and audacity. The alignment looks crowded, the spacing archaic, yet the underlying principles remain timeless. Control the line, manipulate perception, attack where your opponent isn't. It's the same logic that fuels modern spread offenses, just translated through the language of leather helmets and muddy fields. By the mid-1940s, the single wing's reign was beginning to fade. The introduction of the T-formation liner, faster and more adaptable to passing, offered new possibilities. But before that shift, the single wing had already reshaped football's soul. It taught coaches that strategy was theater, and that every movement could serve multiple meanings. It made deception not a trick, but a discipline. Even now, echoes of the single wing survive in wildcat packages, direct snaps, and misdirection plays that disguise intent. Its spirit endures every time a team uses confusion as a weapon. But in the decades before film study and television, its mysteries belonged only to those who ran it, those who believed in its power to make men chase ghosts. The formation's legacy is more than schematic. It represents a moment when football existed in twilight, when cunning mattered as much as strength, when victory could be engineered through secrecy alone. The single-wing-s architects believed that the game's beauty lay not in visibility, but in deception. They built a world where the most brilliant plays left no trace, where mastery was measured in what others failed to see. That mastery would soon face its greatest test. As defenses learned to read misdirection and anticipate motion, offensive minds began to search for alternatives, new ways to distribute the ball, new geometries to counter the tightening field. The single wing's dominance had forced evolution, and evolution always demands adaptation. From its brilliance would emerge the next chapter of football's strategic transformation, the rise of the Notre Dame Box and the gradual awakening of the passing game. The rain had turned the field to chalky mud by halftime. The favored team, a grinding Midwestern powerhouse that lived and died by the single wing, was ahead 13-0 and confident. Their opponents, a Catholic college with undersized linemen and a reputation for gimmicks, huddled in silence. Then their coach, his voice rising above the storm, said only, "They're not guarding the air." The third quarter opened with a play no one in attendance expected. The quarterback took the snap, rolled right, and just as the defense surged toward him, stopped, twisted his shoulders, and launched the ball high into the gray sky. It arced like a prayer and landed 40 yards downfield in the arms of a sprinting receiver. The crowd gasped. 2 plays later, they did it again. The single wing couldn't answer what it couldn't touch. By the game's end, a new idea had taken root in American football. The forward pass could win, not just surprise. That moment fictionalized here from countless real ones captures. The essence of how the Notre Dame Box and the forward pass altered football's trajectory. What Rockne and his players achieved in the 1910s and 1920s wasn't merely innovation, it was liberation. They reimagined space itself, turning football from a ground war into a multi-dimensional game. And though it took the pros years to catch up, the shockwaves of Rockne's offense eventually reached every muddy field from Green Bay to Chicago. The birth of the Notre Dame Box. The Notre Dame Box was, in essence, a cousin of the single wing, but it whispered instead of shouted. Developed by Rockne and his offensive coordinator, Gus Doris, it retained the unbalanced line and deceptive backfield motion, but introduced crucial refinements. The formation's alignment shifted the quarterback closer to the line, enabling faster exchanges and better ball handling. It disguised its intentions through subtle backfield rotations and, most importantly, incorporated the forward pass as a foundational threat rather than a last resort. In the single wing, the tailback dominated the offense. In Rockne's box, every back became a potential thrower or receiver. That multiplicity created chaos for defenses still conditioned to read power first. Rockne called it balance by illusion. He wanted every play to look the same backfield motion. Same cadence, but unfold differently once the ball was snapped. The genius lay in the choreography. The backs would shift before the snap, sliding laterally into the box shape a compact four-man diamond that allowed any of them to take the ball directly. The defense, seeing constant movement, hesitated. That split second of confusion was the offense's advantage. From that structure, Rockne could call sweeps, reverses, delayed handoffs, or passes all with identical pre-snap looks. Notre Dame's version of the forward pass wasn't the desperate heave it had been in the game's early years. It was measured, rhythmic, and calculated. Rockne drilled his players in the precision of timing routes long before the NFL discovered them. Passers practiced quick releases and controlled arcs. Receivers learned to break on signals rather than open space, developing the early logic of what would become modern route trees. The forward pass, from trick to doctrine. The forward pass had been legalized in 1906. But for years, it was treated as an oddity, a sideshow to the violent ballet of line plunges and end runs. Coaches feared interceptions and incomplete passes, both of which carried harsh penalties under early rules. The ball itself was plump and awkward to throw, and the concept of a timing-based offense was alien. Rockne and Doris changed that. In 1913, Notre Dame faced the Army team at West Point, a heavily favored squad that embodied the old guard of football. Doris, the quarterback, and Rockne, his end, executed a passing attack that stunned the crowd and the press. What Rockne understood was that the pass didn't have to replace the run. It could magnify it. By threatening the defense vertically, he could stretch it horizontally. Once safeties and linebackers were forced to respect the possibility of the ball sailing over their heads, running lanes opened underneath. It was tactical psychology at its finest. Manipulate fear to dictate movement. Translating to the pros. By the 1920s, professional football had begun absorbing college talent, but not yet its ideas. The pro game was still dominated by old-school strategists who valued punishment over finesse. The single wing reigned supreme, and coaches viewed the forward pass as a liability. Field conditions and Bend, often muddy, didn't help. Still, whispers from South Bend began to reach professional sidelines. One pro coach, attending a Notre Dame game in 1925, reportedly sat in silence for an entire half before muttering, "They're playing a different sport." That sentiment echoed across the league. The precision, the shifting formations, the sense of orchestration, it all seemed foreign to men raised on brute force. Yet the results were undeniable. Knute Rockne's national fame amplified the message. Newspapers celebrated his four horsemen, immortalized by sports writer Grantland Rice's lyrical prose. College football became theater, while the NFL still resembled a traveling brawl. But behind the spectacle, pro coaches were taking notes. The Notre Dame Box offered not just new plays, but a new logic. That deception and balance could coexist, that power need not exclude elegance. The technical leap, timing and spacing, adapting Rockne's system to the pros was no simple matter. College teams practiced together for months and played fewer games, allowing for choreography and experimentation. Pro rosters changed weekly, and many players worked second jobs. Rehearsing complex motion schemes was impractical. Moreover, without film, imitation depended on memory and rumor. Coaches sketched plays from what they saw in person or read in the sports pages. A misremembered angle or missed assignment could destroy an entire scheme. Still, some persisted. The early 1930s saw a quiet wave of experimentation. Coaches like Dutch Clark and Ponce Clark began incorporating passing concepts into otherwise traditional formations. The Detroit Lions' 1935 championship team, for instance, blended power sweeps with quick, slanting routes, a reflection of Rockne's influence. The key was timing. Rockne's passes were not just long bombs, they were designed. He introduced short hooks, flares, and crossing routes to exploit man coverage. The quarterback learned to throw before the receiver turned, a radical idea in its day. To make it work, precision mattered more than arm strength. Players trained rhythmically, counting steps allowed during practice to synchronize motion and release. That discipline foreshadowed the rhythmic offenses of later decades. Deception reimagined the single wing had thrived on hiding the ball. The Notre Dame Box hid intention. Both relied on psychological warfare, but the latter introduced a new kind of deceit. Narrative deception, plays told false stories. Pre-snap shifts suggested power runs to the strong side, only for the quarterback to pivot and throw against the grain. End-arounds, reverses, and delayed passes became staples. Rockne often said, "The defense is only as honest as you make it." His system forced defenses to declare themselves to reveal coverage before the snap. If a linebacker bit on motion, the pass went over him. If safeties cheated deep, the offense ran underneath. That level of read-based decision-making was revolutionary for its time, and it began to seep into professional coaching philosophy. Still, the pros remained cautious. Teams like the Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers dabbled in the box, but defaulted to their reliable single-wing routes when weather or personnel turned hostile. Yet the seeds of change had been planted. The concept of balance, of using the pass not as desperation, but as design, had entered football's bloodstream. The cultural divide. College football in the 1920s and 1930s was America's great spectacle. Stadiums like Notre Dame's and Michigan's filled with tens of thousands. Radio broadcasts carried games across the country, mythologizing the college game's elegance and strategy. Meanwhile, the NFL was still a regional curiosity. Its coaches and owners, desperate for legitimacy, began borrowing college terminology and formation ideas to attract fans who idolized the campus heroes. Rockne himself flirted with professional consultation before his death in 1931, and several of his assistants later joined pro staffs. Their influence was subtle but lasting. They brought with them the language of precision, route, timing, progression. Terms that would become staples of modern offensive design had their roots in the classrooms and chalk talks of Notre Dame. From box to balance. By the late 1930s, the limitations of the Notre Dame box were becoming clear. The backfield's compactness restricted the quarterback's field of vision. Motion was predictable, and as defenses became faster and more disciplined, the illusion of balance began to fade. Coaches sought a new formation, one that maintained deception, but allowed for greater efficiency in passing. That surge led them to an older, largely forgotten idea: the T formation. It placed three backs directly behind the quarterback, restoring symmetry to the offense. More importantly, it allowed the quarterback to take a direct snap, drop back swiftly, and throw before the defense could react. The single wing had hidden the ball. The T formation would unleash it, but the transition was not immediate. It required visionary coaches, men willing to risk ridicule, to reimagine the structure of offensive football once again. Their experiments, blending Rockne's aerial daring with the precision of motion and blocking from the single wing, would define the next stage of the game's evolution. As one journalist wrote in 1939, "Football is learning to breathe through its lungs instead of its shoulders." The sport was entering a new era, one that would merge the cerebral grace of the Notre Dame box with the mechanical efficiency of the T formation. And the men who led that transformation were already sketching plays in the margins of their notebooks, dreaming of an offense that could finally outpace the past. The chalk squeaked against the blackboard like a living thing. I can still see the white dust cloud rising as he drew slowly, deliberately, the arc of a pulling guard, the angle of a fullback's dive, the faint dotted line of a receiver crossing behind the linebackers. His hand trembled, not from age, but from calculation. Every mark carried intent. Behind him, the locker room was empty, except for the echo of the overhead bulb buzzing in the late hours before game day. That coach, one of many who built football's hidden architecture before television ever arrived, was a craftsman of space. Not a celebrity, not a soundbite. Just a man in wool slacks, sleeves rolled up, sculpting geometry out of chaos. I think of him often when I watch the modern game, where play sheets are laminated. Headsets hum, and entire staffs analyze film in real time. Back then, all strategy began in silence. The pre-television era of football, roughly between the 1920s and 1940s, belonged to the coach's men who had to invent not just plays, but the very language of strategy. They were teachers, psychologists, engineers, and sometimes poets of deception. Among them stood the twin pillars of early professional football, George Halas and Curly Lambeau. Their rivalry was as much intellectual as athletic, a long, slow duel between two minds trying to define what football could become. The blackboards of imagination. Coaching then was an act of faith and secrecy. There were no broadcast angles to study, no film rooms humming with projectors. The blackboard was the entire universe. On it, coaches drew life-size puzzles that only they could decode. George Halas of the Chicago Bears, known for his stoic demeanor and military precision, approached football as a system of control. Every player, every block, every motion was a cog in a greater mechanism. His blackboard sessions were legendary. Circles for linemen, X's for defenders, arrows for destiny. He used chalk the way a conductor uses a baton, commanding invisible music that only the players could hear. Curly Lambeau, in contrast, was fluid, part artist, part improviser. He treated the Green Bay Packers offense as a living organism, adapting it to the weather, the opponent, the moment. His play designs were looser, filled with hand signals, instinct, and trust. Where Halas demanded obedience, Lambeau cultivated belief. Yet both men shared one conviction: their work had to remain unseen. Before television, knowledge was survival. Plays were guarded like military secrets. Coaches developed complex codes to disguise formations when sending in plays from the sideline. Runners or assistants carried messages verbally, and the language itself became a kind of encryption. Red right, Fox 3 might mean a simple off-tackle run, or it might be a layered deception, depending on who heard it and when. There were whispered stories of coaches burning old play sheets after a loss, afraid that someone might retrieve them from the trash. Others locked their notebooks in filing cabinets, some of which would only be discovered decades later by historians combing through family attics. The human web of trust, the architecture of early football, wasn't built by coaches alone. It depended on small, loyal circles, assistants, trainers, and even secretaries who doubled as archivists. One such figure was Bert Bell, who before becoming NFL commissioner served as a coach and strategist. Bell kept a meticulous set of play logs in his handwriting, noting tendencies of rival teams, weather conditions, and even the emotional state of key players. His system prefigured what modern analytics would later become: the art of interpreting human behavior through data. In Chicago, Halas relied on a quiet network of assistants who performed their own kind of espionage. They'd sit in the stands during other teams' games, sketching formations from memory, later reconstructing them in meetings. Each sketch added to the private archive of known looks, allowing Halas to design counters. That was scouting before film existed, a world of note-taking and half-seen clues. Lambeau's inner circle, by contrast, operated like a guild of craftsmen. His assistants contributed plays anonymously, often without credit. If something worked, it belonged to the team, not the author. Those assistants were rarely remembered by name, yet their ideas formed the backbone of the Packers' early dominance. Even team secretaries played a quiet role. They typed and retyped play diagrams, ensuring no one outside the inner circle saw them. In Green Bay, a local stenographer named Dorothy Dillon, whose files historians later uncovered, preserved hundreds of plays written in Lambeau's shorthand. Each page was coded, sometimes labeled only Game 3 Variation B. These were football's lost manuscripts, hidden in plain sight. The craft of concealment, the secrecy extended to practice fields. Teams often trained behind wooden fences or tarpaulin curtains to prevent spies from observing their drills. Hollis was particularly paranoid. He positioned guards, literally guards, around the Bears' practices to chase off anyone loitering near the perimeter. The culture of surveillance that defines modern football had its roots in that paranoia. But the coach's obsession with secrecy wasn't only about protection. It was also about identity. Football, to them, was not entertainment. It was craftsmanship. Plays were intellectual property, the fruit of hours spent in solitude refining the invisible. The idea that cameras might one day dissect those movements for millions to see would have horrified them. When plays were communicated on the field, subtlety was everything. Quarterbacks used coded taps on their linemen's thighs. Backs shifted formations just before the snap to mislead defenders and occasionally their own opponents listening from the sidelines. One account from a 1938 Bears game describes Hollis using his bench players as decoys. He would call out code red loudly, prompting the defense to adjust, only for the actual play to go to the opposite side. It was theater performed in whispers, a psychological duel fought without microphones. The minds behind the machine, both Hollis and Lambeau, were visionaries. But their genius lay in very different kinds of imagination. Hollis, a former Navy man and player himself, understood football as a structured hierarchy. He built systems, block timing, play sequencing, and player discipline that mirrored industrial precision. His Hollis system, developed through the 1930s, broke the game into repeatable components, a precursor to modern play scripting. He once said, "Repetition is the soul of invention." Lambeau's imagination thrived in chaos. He was willing to let a play evolve on the field, trusting his players' instincts to reshape its outcome. He drew inspiration from baseball and hockey sports that rewarded improvisation. Lambeau was also one of the first to stress conditioning and agility over raw size, arguing that speed is deception in motion. His teams moved like dancers, shifting and flowing, disguising their intentions until the snap. Where Hollis studied the opponent, Lambeau studied rhythm. The two philosophies collided in their perennial rivalry, Bears versus Packers, which became as much a battle of wits as of bodies. Every meeting between them was a chess match disguised as a football game. Invention without witness, it's hard to fathom now, but much of this creativity existed without record. There were no television broadcasts, few surviving films, and sparse newspaper coverage. The nuances of play design lived and died within locker rooms. A brilliant misdirection might dominate a game and then vanish forever by Monday morning. That transience gave the era a haunting quality. The coaches knew that their work would likely be forgotten, yet they continued, sketching and revising, driven by the pursuit of perfection. Some plays endured only through oral tradition. Players would describe them decades later at reunions or in interviews. "We had this sweep, the one Lambeau drew after midnight in Cleveland." But without diagrams, the full design was lost. That ephemerality also gave the coaches a kind of purity. They weren't designing for an audience. They were designing for advantage. Every arrow on a chalkboard was a secret weapon, never meant to be admired, only deployed. The unspoken rivalry, the competition between Hollis and Lambeau, pushed the entire league forward. When Hollis unveiled a new blocking scheme, Lambeau would respond with a countering alignment within weeks. Both men employed scouts who attended each other's games, and rumors spread that they occasionally stole each other's discarded play notes. Whether true or not, that myth reinforced the aura of espionage surrounding their work. Even as they built dynasties, the Bears and Packers combining for multiple championships, their real legacy was the intellectual arms race they inspired. Every other team had to evolve or perish. Coaches began thinking more deeply about structure, about creating systems that could adapt and survive. In a sense, they were the first architects of the modern NFL. Their blueprints, the plays, formations, and coded philosophies formed the hidden foundation upon which the televised game would later stand. The hidden genius. There were others too, whose names rarely appear in highlight reels. Clark Shaughnessy, who would later refine the T formation for the Bears. Steve Owen of the Giants, who built defensive countermeasures that mirrored the intricacy of Hollis's offense. And dozens of assistants whose notebooks never left the locker room. They were teachers of motion and intent. One assistant, recalling Hollis years later, said he didn't talk about plays. He talked about behavior. That distinction captures the philosophical depth of the era. These men didn't see football as a set of diagrams, but as a choreography of human instinct, timed, precise, yet always open to surprise. From secret to spectacle. By the late 1940s, radio and film were already eroding the walls of secrecy. Coaches could no longer hide their formations from public view. Every fan began to understand the language of football, the sweeps, the screens, the passes. The mystique was fading, and for many of these early architects, it felt like a loss. Still, the legacy of their secrecy remains embedded in the game's DNA. Modern playbooks, coded terminology, and sideline misdirection all descend from those dimly lit chalkboards and the men who guarded them. Their work was invisible, yet it shaped everything that came after. And just beyond their inventions lay another evolution, one that would push deception to its most theatrical limits. The age of the trick play was about to begin, born from the same minds that once hid the game behind fences and codes. They said the crowd didn't understand what they had just seen. One moment, the quarterback was swallowed by a wall of bodies. The next, the ball appeared 30 yards downfield in the hands of a fullback who had even seemed part of the play. The referee hesitated before raising his arms. The fans looked at each other, uncertain. Even the sports writer in the press box, notebook in hand, later admitted, "I'm not entirely sure where the ball went." That was the power of deception in early football, the ability to make even the witnesses doubt their own eyes. The game in question took place in 1933 between two Midwestern teams. Long since folded, but its mystery endures because the newspaper the next day refused to describe the play in full detail. The coach, citing competitive secrecy, asked that it be left vague. It was, reportedly, a hidden ball play, a sleight of hand, so audacious it was banned the following season. But for one afternoon, it defined the art of illusion that once pulsed through football's bloodstream. Before television, football was not just a sport of strength and strategy, it was a stage for trickery. A chess match of nerves and nerve endings. Coaches operated like magicians, designing plays meant to deceive not only the opponent, but sometimes the audience itself. The rules were looser, interpretations varied by region, and a cunning coach could turn ambiguity into advantage. The hidden ball era, the hidden ball trick, was the purest form of deception, a play designed not to confuse the defense's mind, but its eyes. One of the earliest versions came from the 1905 Carlisle Indian Industrial School, coached by the legendary Pop Warner. His team used misdirection as necessity. Smaller and lighter than most opponents, they relied on speed, disguise, and sleight of hand. In a famous sequence against Harvard, Warner's players modified their uniforms, sewing extra fabric into their jerseys to conceal the ball. On one kickoff, the returner tucked the pigskin inside his shirt and jogged calmly through the chaos as defenders searched frantically for the ball carrier. When he finally broke into a sprint, the field erupted in disbelief. Though legal at the time, the play was immediately outlawed the following season. That spirit of innovation persisted into the professional game. In the 1920s and 1930s, the hidden ball concept evolves not through costume, but through choreography. Quarterbacks and backs perfected the art of the fake handoff, using body language and synchronized motion to sell deception. Some plays were designed so convincingly that even teammates weren't sure who had the ball until the whistle blew. A 1932 account from the Milwaukee Sentinel described a Packers play in which the quarterback, peering to trip, lost the ball to the fullback, who, unseen by most, rolled to his feet and ran free. That kind of ingenuity turned the gridiron into a psychological arena. Deception as designed to modernize, early trick plays seemed theatrical, almost whimsical. But to the coaches who crafted them, deception was as serious a weapon as any blocking scheme. Curly Lambeau, George Halas, and other pioneers believed that misdirection could shift momentum faster than brute force. The reverse, for example, was born from that philosophy. In its simplest form, the play began as a run toward one side of the field, only for a receiver or halfback to loop behind and take a handoff in the opposite direction. But the artistry came in disguise. A successful reverse depended on rhythm, the speed of the fake, the angle of the turn, the timing of the block downfield. The reverse eventually spawned a family of relatives, the double reverse, the end-around, and later the flea flicker, which added a pass to the illusion. Each layer of deception required coordination bordering on choreography. Players practiced their fakes as carefully as ballet dancers practiced steps, each motion calibrated to mislead. Some coaches even drilled their players on facial expressions. One surviving playbook from the 1930s includes the instruction: ball carrier to show eyes wide surprise as if losing the ball. Another note reads, end to run as though blocking. No glance at quarterback. Deception demanded performance. The ethics of trickery, the game's guardians, however, were not always comfortable with such theatrics. The early NFL rulebook was vague on what constituted unsportsmanlike deception. Referees had broad discretion, and rival coaches frequently accused one another of circus football. George Halas once argued that any play legal by the rules was fair game. The purpose, he said, is to score. If your opponent watches your hands instead of the ball, that's his mistake. But others, like Steve Owen of the New York Giants, believed deception should have limits. If the crowd can't follow the play, Owen told reporters in 1938, it ceases to be football. This tension between art and authenticity became one of football's defining philosophical divides. On one side were the innovators, who believed that creativity elevated the sport. On the other were the traditionalists, who feared that deception cheapened its integrity. The league eventually intervened. Certain hidden ball tactics were banned. Equipment modifications became illegal. Direct handoffs after forward motion were restricted. But trick plays persisted in subtler forms. Coaches found new ways to manipulate perception within the rules using lateral passes, disguised blocking angles, or even delayed cadence to distort defensive timing. The local marketplace of creativity. In those pre-television decades, trick plays traveled not through film reels or press releases, but through whispers and imitation. Football's tactical world was a marketplace of ideas, traded from coach to coach like contraband. A successful deception in one small town could ripple across the region within weeks. Assistant coaches might visit rivals under the guise of scouting and return with sketches of curious motions or backfield shifts. High school coaches borrowed from colleges, colleges borrowed from the pros, and everyone claimed authorship. The lack of standardized film meant that no one could prove who truly invented what. A single play might appear under a dozen names. What one team called Ghost Left, another labeled Fadeaway 36. Each was a fingerprint of a different mind interpreting the same trick. Newspapers, hungry for spectacle, sometimes inflated these tales into myth. Reporters described phantom runs or disappearing passes without explaining the mechanics, either because they didn't know or because the coaches refused to tell them. It created an aura of mystery around the sport, a sense that football existed on two levels: one seen, one unseen. When trickery changed history, perhaps the most infamous deception of all came not in college, but in the early professional ranks. The 1934 sneaker game. Played between the New York Giants and the Chicago Bears at the Polo Grounds, remains one of football's legendary moments of ingenuity. The field was frozen, the footing treacherous. At halftime, the Giants trailed, slipping helplessly against the Bears' heavier line. Desperate, Giants coach Steve Owen sent his equipment manager to nearby Manhattan College to borrow basketball sneakers rubber soles that could grip the ice. When the Giants returned to the field wearing them, the crowd laughed. Then the laughter turned to shock as the Giants began to cut, pivot, and sprint past defenders rooted in place. It wasn't a trick play in the traditional sense, but it was deception at its most strategic. The Bears never adjusted, and the Giants scored 27 unanswered points to win the championship. Owen later shrugged off the controversy. "We just used what the rulebook didn't forbid." The episode revealed football's constant dialogue between rule and creativity. What begins as an advantage often becomes outlawed. What seems unsporting one year becomes essential the next. The vanishing tricks as the league professionalized, trick plays gradually receded. They were still used, but cautiously. The risks of failure, loss of yardage, ridicule, or worse, exposure grew too high. And as radio coverage expanded in the 1930s, followed by early game films in the 1940s, secrecy became harder to maintain. Broadcasters began describing plays in detail, explaining formations to the public. The mystique of deception weakened under commentary. Where once a trick play might live for years in rumor, now it was dissected by columnists within hours. The silent cunning of football's magicians gave way to a new transparency. Still, remnants survived. The flea flicker, halfback pass, and Statue of Liberty, all descendants of that hidden ball lineage, remained in playbooks as calculated risks, used to jolt a defense out of complacency. Coaches like Paul Brown and Sid Gilman, though known for structure and precision, occasionally deployed such plays to remind opponents that football's imagination had no expiration date. The artistry of deception didn't vanish, it evolved. The choreography, once hidden by mud and chaos, became codified in audibles, motions, and play-action passes. The smoke and mirrors of early football were absorbed into its bloodstream. The rulemakers and the magicians, it is easy to forget how fragile the balance was between innovation and control. The NFL, seeking legitimacy, often tightened its rules after moments of brilliance. The hidden ball plays were banned. Deceptive substitutions restricted. The laterals constrained. Every new boundary pushed creativity underground, forcing coaches to invent within tighter margins. Yet this friction between freedom and regulation was precisely what kept the game alive. Trick plays tested the limits of legality and imagination. They revealed football not merely as competition, but as expression. Behind every fake and flourish lay a human story. A coach who dared. A player who believed. A crowd left momentarily unsure of what reality they had just witnessed. That brief confusion, that suspension of certainty, was football's purest form of art. The passing of the torch. By the end of the 1940s, the golden age of trickery was dimming. Television loomed, and with it came visibility, analysis, and standardization. Plays that once confounded would soon be replayed, slowed down, and dissected by millions. But before that transformation, there was still one arena where deception met its greatest test: defense. The cat-and-mouse game could not exist without its mirror image, the counter, the reaction, the reading of the unseen. The defenders of that age, men without film, without microphones, guided only by instinct, would rewrite the next chapter of football's evolution. Their response to deception would shape the sport's future balance between illusion and control. He swore he could hear the quarterback's knees pop before the snap. That's what he meant by reading bones. The sound, faint but distinct, told him the count was coming a half-beat earlier than the rest of the line expected. The defensive captain, a wiry man from Canton with a broken nose and an instinct honed by repetition, leaned forward just as the ball moved. He shot the gap, slicing through the interference, and leveled the halfback before the fake could even begin. The play, the same misdirection that had fooled teams all season, died in the mud that day. Everyone else was watching the backfield, he told a reporter decades later. But I was listening to the bones. That small moment captures the essence of early defensive genius, intuition, sensory reading, and a deep feel for the game's rhythm. Before film, before specialized coaching staffs, before signal charts and headset communication, defenders relied on a personal vocabulary of tells the twitch of a lineman's fingers, the angle of a quarterback's stance, even the tension in a fullback's shoulders. They fought deception not with data, but with awareness. The rise of defensive awareness in the 1920s and early 1930s, defenses were still finding their shape. Offenses like the single wing and the Notre Dame Box relied on misdirection and motion, often flooding one side of the field or disguising the ball carrier. The early defensive lines, built primarily for brute resistance, struggled to keep up. Teams typically used 7-man fronts, aligning close to the line of scrimmage to stop the run. It worked until deception made them guess wrong. When the offense shifted, defenders had to rely on instinct and communication. No coach from the sideline could help them once the play began. Linebackers were still a novelty. In many formations, they barely existed. Yet these transitional players, neither linemen nor secondary, became the eyes and ears of the defense. By the late 1930s, those linebackers had become the thinking core of the game. They studied tendencies the way a poker player studies faces. Some even kept notebooks documenting how opponents placed their feet before a sweep or how a guard's first motion gave away direction. The defensive counter to trickery was born not from schematics, but from observation. The discipline of the 6-2-2 front, one of the first great counters to deception, was the 6-2-2 defense. 6 men on the line, 2 linebackers behind, and 3 defensive backs deep. It looked old-fashioned by later standards, but in its time, it was revolutionary. The 6-2-2 was built for clarity. With 6 men controlling the immediate line, every gap had an owner. The linebackers could then read and react, rather than guess, against misdirection offenses. That distinction was everything. George Halas's Chicago Bears were among the first to perfect this structure in the early 1930s. Halas understood that offense was evolving faster than defense, so he treated defense as its own science. His players drilled gap assignments relentlessly. Each man must know not only his gap, but the man opposite, Halas wrote in his 1935 notes. If you don't trust the man next to you, deception wins. The 6-2-2 gave defenders permission to stop chasing the ball and start trusting the system. They didn't need to see where the football was, only to control space so precisely that deception had no room to breathe. But the 6-2-2 had limits. It struggled against the growing sophistication of passing attacks, especially those borrowing from the college T formation. That evolution forced defenses to loosen their structure. Out of that necessity came the 5-3 front, the next stage in football's invisible arms race. The 5-3 and the birth of modern balance. By the early 1940s, teams were passing more. Coaches like Clark Shaughnessy and George Halas were spreading defenses horizontally, forcing them to respect both the run and the pass. The 5-3 defense emerged as a compromise. 5 linemen to handle power, 3 linebackers to read and cover, and 3 defensive backs to protect deep. The beauty of the 5-3 lay in its adaptability. 'Twas a living organism. Linebackers could creep forward into the line or drop back into coverage. Ends could slant inward or flare outward, depending on motion. Deception could still occur, but now, defense had structure and vision. Defenders began to speak of reading keys, watching guards rather than backs, predicting direction based on the first movement of the interior line. It was an intellectual shift as profound as anything in offensive evolution. The game had moved from reaction to interpretation. In one 1941 coaching clinic, Giants coach Steve Owen reportedly told his players, "If you follow the ball, you'll follow the lie. Follow the lineman, and you'll follow the truth." That principle reading structure, not illusion, became the cornerstone of defensive thinking for decades to come. Intelligence on the field before the days of film review. Defensive captains were living databases. They memorized opponent patterns, adjusted formations by instinct, and relayed verbal cues in real time. Some teams used color codes, red for a run to the right, blue for left, while others relied on simple hand gestures or vocal inflections. A 1938 anecdote from the Cleveland Press described how the Rams' defensive leader, Johnny Drake, could call a play before the ball was snapped, simply by watching the quarterback's heels. His success wasn't luck, it was accumulated intelligence. Defenses became laboratories for cognition under pressure. Players had to trust their eyes without being fooled by them, an impossible balance that only repetition could teach. Misdirection lost much of its sting when defenders learned to ignore the backfield altogether and focus instead on movement pulling guards. Blocking angles, the geometry of the play, rather than the drama of it. This mental discipline birthed a new kind of football intellect. Not flamboyant like the offensive innovators, but calculating, stoic, and attuned to detail. The human battle beneath the helmet, it's easy to romanticize deception as pure artistry, but it demanded equal artistry to destroy it. For every quarterback who mastered the fake handoff, there was a linebacker who refused to blink. The early defensive stars met, like Mel Ang of the Giants or Bronco Nagurski, when he switched from offense combined raw strength with uncanny perception. They played by sound as much as sight. They could sense the tempo of a snap count, the muffled grunt of a pulling guard, the hesitation of a back before the sweep. Many claimed they could smell direction, literally detect the breath of the offense leaning one way. Whether true or myth, those instincts were the invisible sensors of early football. Defensive play, at its core, was a test of patience. Deception invited overreaction. The great defenders resisted that invitation. They stood still 1 second longer, trusted their reads, and punished any false move. Substitutions and tactical depth. As offensive trickery evolved, so did defensive specialization. Coaches began experimenting with situational substitutions. Fresh linemen for short yardage, a faster end for pass defense. But in the pre-free substitution era, before 1943, players had to endure both ways, offense and defense alike. This meant defensive intelligence had to be housed within the same men designing offensive deception. The same player who faked a reverse might, on the next series, diagnose one. That symmetry gave early football a kind of ethical balance. Deception was always answered by understanding. When wartime roster shortages forced coaches to think more flexibly, defensive systems became leaner, but smarter. The language of responsibility gap contained pursued, entered the lexicon. Defenses were no longer reacting blindly to chaos. They were engineering order within it. The invisible arms race. By the mid-1940s, offense and defense had entered a state of perpetual adaptation. Every new wrinkle in deception demanded an equal refinement in anticipation. Coaches traded ideas like code breakers in a silent war. A double reverse might work once, but the next week defenses would shift their linebackers to shadow motion. A halfback pass might draw applause, but soon safeties learned to read hand position and anticipate it. The game's innovation cycle compressed from years to weeks, sometimes days. The early 1940s Bears epitomized this evolution. Their famed T-formation offense forced defenses to reorganize entirely, birthing new variations of the 5-3 and even early glimpses of zone coverage. The offense's rhythm was deception through speed. The defense's answer was recognition through structure. Football, once a game of chaos, had become a game of countermeasures. Trust and communication. What separated great defenses from good ones was not just alignment, but trust. Every player had to believe the man beside him would hold his ground. One lineman over-pursued, the entire front collapsed. This bond was often forged not in film rooms, but in conversation after practices, on train rides, or over late-night meals. Veteran defenders would mentor rookies on how to smell a draw, play, or recognize a screen. Teams without written playbooks relied on oral teaching, using shared vocabulary to encode their craft. Such communication bordered on the covert. Players used whispers, taps on the helmet, or subtle shifts in stance to signal adjustments mid-play. Before headsets or wristbands, those gestures were the only lifeline between design and execution. It was football-esque quiet intelligence networking, unspoken conversation that protected against deception as effectively as any rule. The transition to learning systems as the defensive counter matured. So too did the need to preserve and transmit it. Coaches began codifying reads and reactions into manuals. Some of the earliest surviving defensive playbooks date from the late 1930s, handwritten and bound in school binders. They contained crude diagrams, arrows, and annotations like watch, pulling guard, or LB, stay home on motion. These notes became sacred texts, often locked away in trunks or desk drawers after a coach's death. They reveal a culture in transition from instinctive reaction to systematic teaching. The next generation of coaches would take these fragments and turn them into doctrine. Defense would no longer rely solely on memory or intuition. It would be taught. Football's first great age of deception had given birth to its first great science of anticipation. The defenders who once read bones and breath would become the mentors of a new era, one defined by chalkboards, signals, and notebooks filled with countermeasures. It began with a folded card, creased and sweat-soaked, tucked behind the wrist tape of a quarterback standing at midfield. The coach, a shadowed figure on the sideline, tapped his shin twice, then once again. The quarterback nodded. That was all. No shouting, no huddle chaos. Just rhythm, gesture, and shared memory. The defense never saw the conversation happen. That tiny ritual paper and tap was the grammar of early football secrecy. Before television, before film rooms, before radio headsets whispered plays into helmets, the game ran on signals only those inside could read. Every team had its dialect, its slang, its improvised codes. Coaches built entire languages that lived for a season and then vanished, carried only in the bodies of men who played them. The birth of the hidden language in the 1920s and 1930s, football was a game of proximity. The roar of the crowd swallowed words, and the open fields turned any shouted instruction into chaos. So teams invented ways to talk without speaking. Hand signals emerged first, simple at the start. A fist meant run, an open palm pass. A tap to the helmet might signal motion. But as the game's complexity grew, so did its lexicon. Each coach became a linguist of deception. Plays had to be named, remembered, and disguised. Some teams numbered their plays, others used street names, towns, or family references. One 1934 playbook from a Midwestern semi-pro team lists calls like Cleveland, Sister Kate, and Honeymoon, each encoding a specific formation and motion pattern. To outsiders, it was nonsense. To insiders, it was survival. These codes weren't written to hide from fans. They were designed to outwit the sideline spies' assistants or even rival players who tried to leap read or overhear signals. Communication was not just logistics, it was strategy itself. Written secrets playbooks of that era were physical artifacts, handwritten, bound in leather or school notebooks, often personalized to each player. They were not mass-produced. Each one carried the penmanship of the coach and the trust of the team. Players treated them like sacred documents. Losing a playbook was an act of betrayal, and coaches guarded them with near paranoid diligence. Stories circulate of coaches burning old copies in locker room barrels at the end of the season, lest an opponent find them. Others kept them locked in filing cabinets, keys worn on a lanyard beneath their shirts. One anecdote from 1939 recounts how a young assistant for the Bears misplaced a binder on a train between Chicago and Detroit. Hollis reportedly spent the entire next morning rewriting key pages by memory, terrified that a rival might recover it. The binder was never found. Whether the story is embellished or not, the sentiment captures the paranoia of the time. without cameras or centralized archives. A lost playbook wasn't just a document misplaced, it was tactical identity exposed. Gesture and rhythm signals were the live version of those written codes. Every team's sideline became a silent theater. Coaches gestured, paced, adjusted their hats, or rubbed their chins in patterns that carried meaning. Some used assistants as decoys, 3 men signaling at once, only one of whom the quarterback truly watched. A coach might brush his left sleeve to call an inside run or step forward with his right foot to change direction. The players read him like musicians read a conductor. These gestures had to be simple enough to recognize in the chaos of competition, but subtle enough to avoid detection. Opponents were always watching. In one famous 1942 matchup, a rival team supposedly decoded a sequence of hand signals by halftime, intercepting 3 passes in the second half. After that, the victimized coach switched to knee taps and hat brims. Football became, in those moments, a form of choreography, a dance of secrets between sidelines. The captains in human transmission before the era of headset quarterbacks. Team captains were the keepers of communication. They didn't just lead emotionally, they literally carried the plan. The coach might call a formation, but the captain decided how to adapt it on the field. He was a translator between the chalkboard and the mud. Many teams rehearsed plays verbally in the locker room. Players would huddle, close their eyes, and repeat the sequence aloud. Right wing, over. 23 counterfake, split left. The rhythm mattered as much as the content. Once learned, it lived in memory, not paper. This oral culture made football human in a way that would later disappear. Every man knew the system because he was the system. There were no substitution waves, no platoons, no specialists. If you couldn't memorize the language, you couldn't play. Trust was everything. A single player misunderstanding a code could turn a game into chaos. Teams that mastered communication became almost telepathic. Their movements synchronized without visible coordination. Secrecy as art and defense. The secrecy of play calling wasn't just to confuse the opponent, it protected innovation. A new formation or route combination could be worth weeks of advantage. Without film, the only way opponents could learn your plays was by being there in person, taking notes or talking to players who had switched teams. So secrecy was a kind of currency. Coaches like Curly Lambeau and George Halas guarded their innovations the way inventors protect patents. They debut new wrinkles only in critical games, saving them from public eyes. Opponents, meanwhile, tried to infiltrate practices, sending scouts in disguise or bribing local reporters for hints. Some teams practiced behind makeshift tarps or in remote fields outside town where the public couldn't watch. Football, at its highest level, was as much about the unseen as the seen. This arms race of secrecy produced a peculiar form of creativity. Plays weren't just diagrams, they were stories encoded in language, gesture, and rhythm. Every team wrote its own secret script. The oral playbook. In an era when few teams had consistent documentation, oral playbooks became a living tradition. Older players mentored rookies, passing down strategies verbally, often with anecdotal explanations. When you hear Iowa, think left, a veteran might whisper. When he slaps his thigh twice, it's a fake. This apprenticeship built loyalty. You didn't just learn football, you inherited a dialect. Those who broke the code or shared it elsewhere were ostracized. By the late 1930s, as teams began to stabilize and rosters became more professional, this oral system fused with written documentation. Coaches would still speak in code, but the notebooks started to record the grammar. A single note like 5 lefty might encapsulate a whole page of motion and timing. Each franchise became a secret society of notation. The diagrams of that era, preserved in archives today, are nearly indecipherable without explanation lines, dots, and shorthand that look more like musical notation than sport. Practicing without film. Practices were laboratories of memory. Without film to analyze, players relied on repetition and verbal correction. Coaches described what they saw. Players listened and adjusted. If a guard missed his block, the coach didn't replay it, he redrew it in chalk and told the story again. Scrimmages were the only feedback loop. To learn a play, players had to feel it, not just see it. This kinesthetic learning created a different kind of intelligence, body memory over visual recall. When mistakes occurred, they became folklore. Players would joke about ghost routes or invisible cuts that existed only because someone misread a signal. Those improvisations sometimes turned into new plays entirely. The lack of rigid structure made early football endlessly adaptive. The role of the quarterback, in this silent language, was more than a thrower. He was an interpreter. His eyes scanned the sideline, catching the coach's subtle motion. Then, with one look, one phrase in the huddle, he translated it into execution. Quarterbacks had to be multilingual, fluent in the coach's signals, the lineman's shorthand, and the receiver's adjustments. Their voices carried the rhythm of strategy. Many used dummy counts and decoy cadences to conceal the real snap. Each game was a linguistic duel who could speak clearly while hiding the truth. Code breaking and countermeasures. Where there is code, there are code breakers. Rival teams developed specialists who watched opponents' sidelines, trying to decode signals through binoculars. Newspapers occasionally hinted at these espionage tactics, describing how assistants scribbled notes on napkins during games. Some coaches responded by creating dual signalers, 2 or 3 men giving conflicting cues. Only the quarterback knew which one to watch. Others sent players into the huddle with verbal instructions disguised as casual talk. This covert war of communication laid the foundation for the signal complexity that modern football still uses. Today's wristbands and radio headsets are technological heirs to those hand gestures and whispers from the sideline. When language failed for all its ingenuity, secrecy sometimes broke under pressure. Fatigue, noise, or weather could blur signals. Rain turned note cards into pulp. Sunlight blinded players trying to catch a sideline gesture. Miscommunication could cost championships. Yet even in failure, there was poetry. It's confusion, the improvised corrections. It's a shared understanding that emerged mid-play. All of it reflected a sport built on intuition and trust. The absence of television meant that language was private. No replay could expose the codes. No commentator could translate them. The field was a closed world, and its language died each Sunday only to be reborn anew. The lingering legacy, some fragments of those languages still survive. In archives and museums, yellowed notebooks bear traces of old shorthand, arrows, dots. Cryptic letters like RZB or 3L shift. Coaches today would struggle to interpret them. Yet they represent the DNA of modern play calling. When radio and television arrived, this private language began to dissolve. Broadcasters demanded explanations. Coaches had to name their creations in public terms. What had once been whispered on muddy sidelines became diagrams on national screens. The game lost some of its secrecy, but it also found its new audience. That transformation, the slow surrender of silence to spectacle, would change football forever. The scout leaned against the train window as the Midwest blurred via 1,000 miles of farmland and fog. In his coat pocket was a notebook the size of a wallet, its pages half-torn and smudged with graphite. His assignment was simple: watch the upcoming opponent, the Milltown Miners, and return with enough insight to tilt the game. No film, no reels. Just his eyes, his pen, and the hope that what he saw would still matter a week later. That was how scouting worked before the age of cameras. Strategy moved at the speed of rail. The age of the traveling scout in the 1920s and 1930s, professional football operated on lean budgets and leaner staff. A single scout might be responsible for an entire region, hopping trains or hitching rides to small-town fields where future opponents played. There was no official credentialing, just an old-fashioned ticket and a hat pulled low to avoid recognition. A good scout knew how to blend in. He'd sit among the fans, buy a hot dog, maybe strike up a conversation with a local booster. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to remember. These men became the eyes of their teams in a world without film. They jotted cryptic notes in shorthand: number 33, pull, R. LB bites early, QB fake left, often the kind of skeletal data that might not look like much but could define a strategy. Coaches back home would pore over these notes as if decoding enemy transmissions. The scouts weren't just observers, they were translators. They turned the motion and instinct of a live game into a usable map. Watching without rewinding, the absence of film turned observation into a performance of focus. A modern scout can pause, replay, slow down, and measure a player's steps to the inch. Early scouts had one shot, one look at each play. Miss it, and the information was gone forever. Many brought binoculars, sketch pads, or even rudimentary diagrams. Some developed personal shorthand systems that looked like hieroglyphs: triangles for linemen, circles for backs, arrows for routes. After the game, they'd spend hours in their hotel rooms reconstructing what they saw from memory before it faded. The pressure was immense. Coaches demanded precision from impressions. What kind of offense did they run? Might seem simple, but without film, even that was an interpretive act. A scout might misidentify a play-action fake as a real run or confuse a formation due to poor sightlines. Yet in that uncertainty lay creativity. Scouting became as much about reading tendencies as recording plays. You didn't need perfect accuracy. You needed intuition. A scout learned to sense rhythm, the way a team breathed before it struck. The Scout's Notebook. Every franchise had its secret notebooks. Some were neat ledgers filled with columns for formations, key players, and down tendencies. Others were chaotic scribbles, arrows, and half-sentences written during the motion of a game. One surviving example from a 1938 college scout shows entries like, number 7, quick first step. Inside, gap soft, weak back pedal. Wingback hides in stance. Watch reverse early downs. This fragmentary writing was the DNA of game planning. A head coach might receive just 2 pages of this and have to build an entire defensive strategy from it. The scouts themselves became minor legends within organizations. They weren't famous, but coaches trusted their instincts the way generals trust their field officers. Some developed reputations for uncanny accuracy, predicting a play or identifying a weakness others had missed. Others, not so much. One infamous story tells of a scout who returned to Green Bay insisting a rival S-star halfback had a limp. The team adjusted their defense accordingly, only to discover on game day that the man had been limping because of uneven turf. Without film, exaggeration, bias, and even fatigue shaped perception. Football strategy in those years lived and died by the imperfections of memory. Local eyes and newspaper clues when scouts couldn't make it in person. Coaches turned to another source: local newspapers. Sports sections of the 1920s and 1930s often provided vivid, if romanticized, accounts of games. They described formations, standout players, and trick plays in dramatic prose. The Grangers sprang a dazzling crisscross maneuver in the third quarter, sending their fleet halfback skimming past a confused line. That one sentence could reveal everything a rival coach needed to know. A misdirection play, timing, maybe even formation tendencies. Teams clipped these reports and stored them in binders. A single sports editor's metaphor might become a scouting lead. Some coaches built entire game plans off newspaper reports, especially when their opponent came from distant states. Reporters, knowingly or not, became tactical informants. In smaller towns, they sometimes chatted openly with coaches, giving away more than they realized. By the 1940s, some teams had learned to feed newspapers deliberate misinformation, false formations, inflated statistics to mislead future opponents. The press, in that sense, became both scout and smokescreen. Scouting as espionage, scouting without film often bordered on spycraft. Coaches sent friends of the program to attend games incognito, posing as alumni or traveling salesmen. One would stand behind an opponent's bench, pretending to cheer, while quietly noting substitutions and patterns. Rules against this kind of espionage were vague, and enforcement nearly non-existent. Everyone did it. One week, you were the observer. The next, the observed. Some teams took it further, booking hotel rooms across from rival practice fields, peering through binoculars at morning drills. It was an era when information felt like gold dust, and men were willing to bend ethics to mine it. But the most valuable scouts were those with good memories and better instincts. They could spot the subtle tells: how a guard leaned before a pull, how a fullback adjusted his stance before a fake. It wasn't about film. It was about pattern recognition born from experience. Fragmented truths. The greatest limitation of pre-film scouting was fragmentation. No one ever saw the whole picture. A scout might attend one game in poor weather or against a weak opponent. The resulting report would be skewed by circumstance. Coaches compensated through synthesis. They'd combine multiple eyewitness reports, newspaper clippings, and personal correspondence from old coaching contacts. It was football anthropology, piecing together culture from fragments. Still, errors were inevitable. A team might prepare for a power-running offense only to face a spread formation they'd never seen before. Misunderstanding was baked into the process. Paradoxically, this scarcity of reliable intel encouraged tactical invention. Because teams couldn't know exactly what was coming, they had to design flexible systems that could adapt mid-game. Versatility became survival. Football, in this light, wasn't a scripted contest, but a duel of improvisers. The gift of imperfection for all its flaws. This imperfect system had advantages. Limited scouting made the game unpredictable and deeply human. Each coach's imagination mattered more than any database. Surprise plays, later impossible under film scrutiny, were still genuinely surprising. A team could reinvent itself week to week. Coaches could experiment freely, knowing no one would have footage to dissect their innovations. Trick plays, new formations, and deceptive alignments thrived in this informational wilderness. It was an age of boldness. Mistakes were frequent, but so were miracles. Scouting networks and word of mouth. By the late 1930s, informal scouting networks began to form. Coaches exchanged letters or phone calls with trusted colleagues in other regions. How's their quarterback under pressure? Do they pull the guard on sweeps? These quiet correspondences created early data webs, human precursors to the analytics pipelines of today. A coach might call an old college friend coaching at a rival school for inside tips. Loyalty blurred. Favors were traded. One note from an ally could change the season's course. Still, these relationships relied on discretion. To be known as a loose talker was career poison. Information was power, and power demanded silence. The tactician's workshop. Back home, the coach received the scout's report like a war general studying reconnaissance sketches. The staff gathered in smoky offices, replaying the scout's descriptions aloud, recreating the opponent's tendencies through imagination. They'd mark the chalkboard: guard pulls right, halfback delays, and crashes too soon. Each note became a rehearsal of probability. The game plan that emerged was not a mirror of the opponent, but a psychological portrait how they might behave under pressure. Coaches built counterplays based on educated guesses. Sometimes they guessed wrong. Sometimes they guessed so right it looked prophetic. The margin between genius and luck was often no more than the flicker of a memory in a scout's notebook. The human cost of guesswork. The scouts themselves lived hard, lives poorly paid, constantly traveling, always one step behind the schedule. They rode trains, buses, sometimes borrowed cars. Their meals were quick, their sleep light. Many developed chronic exhaustion or poor eyesight from years of squinting across sunlit fields. But they believed in their mission. They were the unseen architects of victory, the invisible layer beneath every Sunday spectacle. For some, their greatest reward came not in recognition, but in validation when a coach quoted their report in a pre-game speech, or when a defensive adjustment born from their notes turned the tide of a championship. Their work was fleeting but vital. From the field to the press, by the time radio broadcasts became common in the late 1930s, the nature of scouting began to shift. Coaches started listening to games over the airwaves, noting verbal cues from announcers. A sharp listener could hear whether a team favored certain alignments or down tendencies. Reporters became intermediaries, some knowingly aiding teams, others simply chronicling games for public consumption. The line between public narrative and private strategy began to blur. That blurring between what was known, what was hidden, and what was invented by the media would define the next stage of football's evolution. As the game moved toward visibility, secrecy had to evolve. Because soon, the world would be watching. It's 3rd and 2 on the Bears' 45. They're lining up heavy left again. Looks like Hallis wants that counter sweep. Yes. There it goes. Jones cuts outside. He's free. The announcer's voice rises, carried over hundreds of miles of wire, across living rooms and taverns. Fans lean closer, feeling the rhythm of the game through words alone. But in one of those living rooms sits a rival assistant coach, scribbling notes on a legal pad. Heavy left, counter sweep. The next week, that same formation fails. The defense shifts early. The play dies in the backfield. For the first time in the sport's young history, a single sentence spoken in excitement has altered the strategic future of professional football. The airwaves arrive. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, radio became the sport's second heartbeat. The NFL was still small, regional, and financially fragile, but the radio made it national, at least in imagination. Early broadcasts were primitive. Announcers didn't always see the field clearly. They relied on spotters with binoculars and field charts. Some worked from telegraph updates hundreds of miles away, recreating the play-by-play from code transmitted in real time. The sound of a wooden block hitting a desk became the thud of a tackle. And yet, those illusions mattered. Radio built narrative continuity. It turned scattered towns and franchises into one shared world of football. But with it came an unintended consequence: exposure. Before radio, play calling was a local dialect. A team's tendencies, formations, motions, and misdirections were known only to those who saw them in person. Radio changed that overnight. Suddenly, entire audiences were hearing how teams played. And among those listeners were the men who'd have to stop those plays next Sunday. The voice that gave too much away. Coaches quickly realized that announcers, in their effort to paint the action vividly, were broadcasting their playbooks. One legendary story, told in coaching circles, involves a 1934 radio broadcast of a Chicago Bears game. The announcer, an enthusiastic local favorite, had a habit of explaining formations before each snap. "There's that unbalanced line again," he'd say. And the fullback said a little deeper, probably the power toss. He wasn't wrong, but his accuracy was a problem. By the next week, the Bears' opponents had listened to the rebroadcast and picked up the cues. They shifted their linebackers when the deep fullback appeared. The play, once unstoppable, sputtered. George Hallis, furious, reportedly called the station manager that Monday. "Tell your man," he barked, "if he's gonna coach my opponents, he'd better wear a whistle." No one ever confirmed that quote on record, but several former Bears staffers repeated versions of the story years later. The lesson spread fast. The microphone could be as dangerous as the opposing defense. The birth of the public playbook. As football's popularity grew, newspapers began to play their own part in the slow unveiling of strategy. By the mid-1930s, sports editors wanted more than box scores. They wanted diagrams, the inside look at how the professionals do it. Sunday supplements began running play charts sketched from interviews or secondhand observation. A headline from a 1936 Pittsburgh paper read, "Packers Wing Trick explained how Lambeau uses shifting backs to fool defenses. Below, it ran a crude diagram, 4 dots in the backfield, arrows curling and crossing. It was the first time many fans saw the anatomy of a play. To readers, these diagrams were entertainment. To rival coaches, they were intelligence leaks. Curly Lambeau himself dismissed such features, publicly calling them guesswork. But he also quietly began altering his alignments before high-profile games, just in case. Radio's double-edged power for the teams. Radio was both lifeline and liability. It built fan bases in distant markets, kept franchises solvent, and turned players into household names. But it also compressed the sport into words that, intentionally or not, carried tactical detail. Announcers faced an impossible task: describe enough to thrill listeners, but not so much that they armed opponents. Some adopted coded phrases. Instead of unbalanced line, they'd say heavier right side. Instead of slot receiver, they'd describe a man out wide and another tucked inside. Still, the most perceptive listeners could decode patterns. Coaches began holding meetings with broadcasters before games, politely requesting restraint. Some teams even provided approved terminology lists to stations. Others tried to control press box access entirely, but the genie was out of the bottle. Once football strategy entered the public lexicon, it could not be withdrawn. The newspaper race, while radio transmitted emotion, newspapers defined interpretation. Reporters, eager to differentiate themselves, began portraying games as cerebral battles rather than brute contests. Columns described coaches as field generals, players as tacticians. The language of war flanks, assaults, countermeasures entered sports writing. Readers loved it. But the detail came at a cost. The more the media dramatized how a team won, the harder it became for that team to keep its secrets. Writers sometimes published detailed analyses based on sideline observation. In 1941, one columnist for the Chicago Tribune famously described how the Bears' fake reverse worked by using the right half as bait. Within weeks, the move appeared on scouting reports across the league. The public's hunger for understanding forced teams to evolve. They couldn't rely on mystery anymore. The game was becoming transparent, narrated, diagrammed, and deconstructed in real time. The first cracks in secrecy, the deeper media looked, the less room coaches had to hide. A single radio call, T-formation again, watch the fullback dive, could undo a week of preparation. A newspaper diagram could expose a trick play that once fooled everyone. In that transparency lay both progress and loss. Football was becoming standardized. The once fluid, improvisational style of the pre-television era was giving way to codified patterns. Fans now expected to understand what they saw. Complexity had to be narratable. Plays had to make sense on air. Broadcasters, seeking clarity, avoided describing unconventional formations. They confused listeners. So teams began trimming them out. Innovation, once driven by secrecy, started bending to presentation. Media as a tactical force, the most astute coaches realized something profound. Radio and newspapers weren't just chronicling the game, they were shaping it. If announcers emphasized power running, fans expected it. If columnists called a formation cowardly or tricky, coaches risked public backlash for using it. The aesthetic of football, the idea of what was honorable or beautiful, was being constructed by voices with microphones and typewriters. Some adapted brilliantly. Clark Shaughnessy, architect of the modern T-formation, used media coverage to his advantage. He allowed selective leaks about his offensive philosophy, framing it as scientific rather than deceptive. Reporters loved it. By the time opposing teams grasped his concepts, the Bears had already used them to revolutionize the game. Others struggled. Teams known for trickery or confusion found themselves branded as gimmick offenses. Public taste, shaped by coverage, became a silent referee. Football's invisible line between strategy and showmanship was being redrawn. Adjustments in the shadows by the early 1940s. the smarter franchises began running closed practices, a novelty at the time. They stationed staff at gates, preventing journalists or curious locals from watching drills. Some teams practiced in borrowed high school stadiums miles away to preserve secrecy. Coaches also began naming plays more generically to prevent leaks. What was once called Minnesota misdirection became 48 counter. Coded simplicity replaced colorful flair. Media pressure also affected player interviews. Quarterbacks were coached on what not to say. A casual post-game comment, "We L hit them with that same cross-motion next week," could endanger the playbook. The walls around strategy were growing higher, but the light was already streaming in through cracks. The public construction of knowledge? Meanwhile, fans were learning. Radio taught them down and distance awareness. Newspapers showed diagrams. For the first time, the public began to believe they understood football not just as spectacle, but as system. This collective learning reshaped the sport's meaning. It became not just a contest of strength, but a contest of intellect, coaches as thinkers, players as executors. Yet that enlightenment had a cost. The deeper the public looked, the more the mystery faded. The clandestine language of playbooks, once whispered in locker rooms, became national discourse. Football's inner sanctum was dissolving under its own popularity. The feedback loop by 1945, the loop between performance and perception, was complete. Coaches watched how newspapers described them and began shaping their tactics accordingly. A team known for grinding football leaned into that image. Another, branded as tricky, toned down deception to protect reputation. The game wasn't just played anymore, it was performed for understanding. Radio announcers learned to call plays with theatrical rhythm. Writers began scripting narratives of redemption, strategy, and innovation. Fans consumed football not merely as competition, but as serialized storytelling. It was a new reality, football as both game and broadcast medium. The end of pure secrecy, the sport that began in muddy fields of hidden playbooks and whispered signals, was now a public conversation. Strategy had entered the commons. Coaches could still innovate, but no longer in total darkness. Every great idea risked discovery by microphone or pen. Every new formation was one newspaper illustration away from imitation. The game was better understood, but less mysterious. This tension between revelation and concealment would soon provoke deeper structural changes. The league, seeking balance between spectacle and fairness, began codifying rules to standardize formations, substitutions, and motion. Strategy was about to be rewritten, not by coaches, but by the rulebook itself. The rulebook was never just a document. To the early architects of football, was a living organism, a shifting landscape where each new line of text carried the power to reshape the game overnight. Coaches didn't merely read the rules, interpreted them, mined them for opportunity, and treated every amendment like revelation. I still remember holding one of those old rulebooks in a museum archive, the 1933 edition. Its pages thin as communion wafers, the margins filled with penciled notes from a long-gone coach. Beside a single paragraph, a forward pass may be thrown from anywhere behind the line of scrimmage. He had written one word. Finally. That single rule, enacted in 1933, did what decades of coaching genius could not. It liberated the offense from geography. The law as catalyst. Before the 1930s, football was a ground-bound world. The forward pass had been technically legal since 1906. But the rules restrictions: no passing from within 5 yards of the line, no incompletions out of bounds, severe penalties for mishandling made it a gamble. Teams treated it as novelty, not foundation. Then came a wave of reforms led by men like George Halas and Curly Lambeau, who argued that professional football would never thrive without offensive dynamism. The Depression had drained audiences. Games were low-scoring and often brutal stalemates. A wider, faster game might draw crowds. So in 1933, the league rewrote the rules. Passing was freed from its shackles. Receivers could line up anywhere behind the line. Incompletions stopped being turnover-worthy sins. The field, once narrow in purpose, became a canvas for imagination. Almost immediately, strategy shifted. The old single-wing offenses built for power and misdirection had to evolve or perish. Hollis began experimenting with the T formation, placing the quarterback directly under center to disguise timing and exploit the new latitude. It was a revolution born not from invention, but from interpretation. When a play died overnight, but the same rules that created innovation could also destroy it. There is a story from 1940 that every old coach knows: the outlawing of the cradle kick. For years, a few cunning teams had used a play where the holder, instead of kicking, would scoop the ball into his arms and run behind the screen of blockers. It was part fake punt, part sleight of hand. The crowd loved it. Opponents despised it. Then, after a particularly chaotic game in which the play caused confusion and injury, the league declared it illegal. No player receiving a snap for a scrimmage kick shall advance the ball beyond the line of scrimmage. In one paragraph, a beloved deception was gone. An assistant coach of the era wrote later, "We built half a season's strategy around that fake." When they banned it, it felt like losing a limb. Football, they learned, was not only a contest between teams, but between creativity and control. The rulebook as a battlefield. Coaches like Hollis and Lambeau became theologians of the rulebook. They studied its wording like sacred text, searching for loopholes. The gray areas became laboratories. What exactly constituted a shift? Could two men move simultaneously if one paused for a beat? What's a player downfield if he stopped 1 yard shy of the designated line? Each interpretation opened a door. One Chicago assistant recalled spending hours in smoky back rooms debating with referees during the offseason, trying to clarify ambiguous phrasing. "We didn't argue rules," he said. "We argued meaning." And through those arguments, football evolved. The referee as architect. Referees weren't just enforcers, they were co-authors. In the early decades, officiating crews were small, their authority vast. Calls were made by instinct, not replay. Interpretation depended on the official's understanding of the game, which varied wildly. A referee from the 1930s once admitted that his decision-making often came down to what felt like football. If a play seemed unsporting, it was flagged. If it seemed ingenious, it was allowed. That informal moral code shaped strategy more than any rule change. Coaches learned to design plays not just for efficiency, but for legibility. They needed to look like football to avoid penalty. And as referees adapted, so did innovation. Blocking and the hidden reformation, perhaps the most consequential shift of all, came through the evolution of blocking. Before the late 1930s, blocking was heavily restricted. Offensive linemen could not extend their arms. Contact had to be made close to the body. Open field interference was tightly policed. The result was a grinding, congested style of play that rewarded brute power over fluidity. Then, gradually, enforcement softened. The game's governors realized that professional football needed rhythm and movement, something more watchable than piles of bodies. By the mid-1940s, shoulder blocking became accepted practice. Offensive lines began to pull and trap, creating the lanes that would later define modern offenses. A quiet revolution had occurred not through a headline rule change, but through evolving referee interpretation. The officials had, consciously or not, rewritten the game's grammar. Substitution and the birth of the specialist in the earliest years. Teams played both ways, offense and defense, with the same 11 men. Substitution was limited. Once a player left, he could not re-enter until the next quarter. It made stamina as valuable as skill. Strategy was necessarily conservative, built on endurance rather than specialization. But in 1941, as wartime shortages and roster turnover strained teams, the league eased substitution restrictions. Suddenly, coaches could deploy platoons of fresh players for specific roles. This small rule unlocked a tactical explosion. Kickers, punters, and return men began to emerge as specialists. Offensive units could feature smaller, quicker players, while defenses packed with heavier tacklers took the field next. Coaches could experiment with tempo-ruining no-huddle drives to exploit fatigue or saving formations for rested personnel. In effect, the game divided into phases. Offense, defense, and special teams each became its own realm, with distinct strategy and expertise. The gray zone, exploiting the margins. Every generation of coaches sought the gray zones, the ambiguous edges of legality. In the 1930s, teams experimented with deceptive motion, where backs feigned movement before the snap, testing how long they could dance before being called for a legal shift. In the 1940s, others toyed with illegal formations disguised by clever alignment, daring referees to notice. Clark Shaughnessy, the Stanford coach who brought the modern tee to the pros, was famous for his rule-bending curiosity. He reportedly said, "The rulebook tells you what's forbidden, not what's possible." He meant that progress often came from stretching the limits of perception, finding the space between what the rules stated and what the referee saw. The philosophical divide. As the 1940s closed, a deep philosophical divide emerged among coaches. One camp believed the game should be pure improvisation, a contest of intelligence and adaptability, not legislation. They saw the rulebook's growing complexity as suffocating creativity. The other camp viewed structure as the path to greatness. To them, rules were constraints that fostered innovation, boundaries that forced refinement. This tension mirrored broader American ideals: freedom versus order, risk versus discipline. Football had become a metaphor for both. Strategy becomes codified. By the late 1940s, every new rule adjustment carried strategic consequences. When the league standardized the hash marks in 1935, narrowing the field placement of the ball, it changed blocking angles, kick trajectories, and play design philosophy. When it allowed offensive linemen to leave the line of scrimmage earlier on punts, it altered return formations. Each subtle amendment rewrote the relationship between geometry and intention. And with every change, coaches recalculated the map of possibility. One veteran coach described the process as learning to play chess on a board that kept moving. The rulebook as a mirror in hindsight. The rulebook wasn't merely a set of laws, was a mirror of the era's values. The early years prized toughness, so the rules celebrated contact. As the game sought audiences, the rules favored excitement and scoring. When television loomed on the horizon, clarity and standardization became paramount. Football's soul was negotiated in those pages: its ethics, aesthetics, and limits defined by what could and could not be done. Coaches might complain, but they all understood. Every boundary invited a new breakthrough. Every prohibition spawned a new idea. Reading between the lines, I've often wondered what it felt like to be one of those early tacticians, waiting for the league office to release the new rulebook each offseason. Did they read it with dread or anticipation? In those fragile pages lay the fate of entire playbooks. A single clause could invalidate months of invention or open a door no one had seen before. One assistant from that era compared it to studying the weather. He said, "You didn't control it. You just learned how to play in it." And that, in many ways, was the essence of early football strategy. Adaptation not just to opponents, but to the invisible hand of regulation. The men who thrived weren't merely the strongest or fastest. They were the ones who could translate legal language into kinetic motion. Toward the next frontier, by the end of the 1940s, coaches had accepted the rulebook as both adversary and ally. The smartest among them no longer resisted change, they anticipated it. Every tweak and substitution, every clarification of motion, every new penalty became raw material for innovation. The sport was evolving through constraint, learning to dance with its own laws. And just as the field of play expanded through passing and blocking reforms, another realm was quietly forming at the edges of the game: special teams. Born from substitution, freedom, and rule reinterpretation. Kicking and return strategy became the new laboratory of hidden edges, the next frontier where creativity would thrive beyond the reach of television or public expectation. There's an old newspaper clipping from November 1930, 8 creased, yellowed, and nearly brittle, recounting a moment that feels like myth today. Late in the fourth quarter, rain pouring over a mud-choked field in Pittsburgh. The crowd rose to its feet as the quarterback stepped back not to pass, but to drop the ball. It struck the turf once, bounced true, and he swung his leg through, sending it sailing in a perfect arc through the uprights. A dropkick field goal. The rarest of all plays, executed as if time itself had stalled to watch. Today, the idea seems almost cinematic, a relic from a vanished era of football. But before television, before hash marks and standardized football shapes, kicking wasn't just a scoring mechanism. It was strategy, a tactical art form built from improvisation, surface, and nerve. The lost geometry of the ball before 1934. The football wasn't the aerodynamic torpedo we know now, which was rounder, closer to a rugby ball. That shape, awkward for tight spirals, was perfect for unpredictable bounces and touch kicks. Coaches exploited this. A well-timed dropkick could turn a busted drive into a quick 3 points. Punters would angle their kicks off the oblong edges to die inside the opponent's 5-yard line. The very physics of the ball invited creativity. When the league slimmed the ball to favor passing, the geometry of kicking changed. Dropkicks lost their reliable bounce. Squibs became erratic. Directional punting demanded a precision that only specialized technique could maintain. It was an unintended casualty of evolution. The ball itself had closed a chapter in football's playbook. The dropkick, poetry in chaos. To understand the dropkick's beauty, you have to picture its rhythm. The kicker cradled the ball chest high, eyes on the horizon. He'd drop it deliberately, no spin, no wobble, timing his foot to meet it on the rise from its single bounce. A perfect strike sent it in Dover end through the uprights. A miss sent it skittering uselessly downfield. The play demanded both nerve and instinct. There was no placeholder, no tee, no pause, just the player, the ball, and the mud. In the early 20th century, dropkicks were weapons of choice. Players like Patty Driscoll, Jimmy Conzelman, and Curly Lambeau could swing momentum with a well-timed boot. Hollis once said that a good dropkicker was worth a touchdown before the game began. Then, slowly, the art withered. By the 1940s, better turf, slimmer balls, and evolving formations made it obsolete. Place kicks and punts became standardized, predictable. The dropkick, part improvisation, part sorcery, slipped into memory. Yet, even decades later, its ghost lingered. In 1941, the Chicago Bears' Ray McLean stunned a crowd with the last successful dropkick field goal in NFL history. The crowd's roar carried more nostalgia than triumph. They knew they were witnessing an ending. The pooch punt and the element of surprise. If the dropkick was art, the pooch punt was cunning. Quarterbacks used it as a hidden dagger, fake pass turned soft punt that caught defenses flat-footed. From a passing formation, the QB would take the snap, step back, and deliver a short lofted kick designed to land just beyond the returner's reach and roll dead. The tactic thrived on deception. Teams that mastered it blurred the line between offense and special teams. It was field position as sleight of hand. The Green Bay Packers used it masterfully in the late 1930s, weaponizing confusion. Lambeau's teams could drive to midfield, stall, and still win the next exchange by burying the opponent inside their own 10-yard line. As one old assistant said, it wasn't about scoring. It was about suffocating. But with the arrival of more sophisticated punters and long-snapping specialists in the 1940s, the pooch punt faded. Its versatility, its unpredictability was sacrificed for specialization. Modern football gained efficiency but lost a layer of tactical mischief. The onside kick, gamble as science. Before television and before modern kickoff formations, the onside kick was not desperation. It was design. Early teams saw the kickoff as a live chess move. The ball's unpredictable bounce on muddy fields made recovery possible. Some teams even built entire game plans around the technique. The 1930s saw an array of bizarre variations. The sleeper, onside kicked deliberately toward an uncovered sideline. The chop onside bounced off the ground to maximize chaos, and the delayed onside faked deep, then short. Players memorized the texture of fields, the angle of slopes, the weight of wet turf. Weather became part of play design. In one legendary 1935 matchup between the Bears and the Cardinals, an onside kick in the final 2 minutes led to the game-winning touchdown. The ball had ricocheted off a lineman's helmet, been scooped by a halfback, and carried across the goal line before the defense realized what had happened. The crowd went silent before it cheered. That was the onside kick's magic, the blend of calculation and chaos. Today, rule changes like restrictions on running starts and tighter formation spacing have nearly killed its viability. But in the pre-television game, it was not a miracle. It was a tactic. Whether the invisible playmaker to understand old football strategy, you must understand weather. Rain didn't just soak the field. It rewrote the rulebook. Mud changed the spin of punts. Snow muffled kicks, turning the ball into a dead weight. Cold stiffened leather, shortening distances. Coaches adapted by designing weather-specific playbooks. A muddy field meant shorter punts and more pooches. A frozen surface favored low, bouncing onside kicks. Some teams even carried alternate balls, one for dry days, one for rain, with slightly different grip and inflation. Games weren't merely contests between rosters, but between conditions. One old scout once said, "In rain, your kicker was your quarterback." Because when throwing and running failed, only the foot could still bend the game. The tactical punt, territory as power before television reduced field position to analytics. The punt was a moral statement. It wasn't a surrender, it was control. Coaches like Hallis treated the 40-yard line like a hinge of war. A well-executed punt pinned the opponent deep, forced a fumble in the mud, or invited a safety. In low-scoring games where touchdowns were precious, punting was how you dictated rhythm. Teams studied punt angles, return tendencies, and the psychology of field position. Some punters, like Dutch Clark, became celebrities for their ability to place the ball. The difference between a 50-yard punt and a 42-yard punt could define a career. It's no exaggeration to say that in the 1920s and 30s, punters were the quarterbacks of the game's moral tempo. They controlled flow, dictated patience, and embodied the era's belief that restraint was as valuable as risk. Why kicking faded? The death of tactical kicking came gradually, not dramatically. First, the ball changed shape. Then, substitution rules allowed specialists to emerge. Coaches stopped teaching quarterbacks to drop kick or halfbacks to punt. By the late 1940s, kicking was no longer improvisation, it was an industrial process. Long snappers, holders, and kickers formed dedicated units. Execution replaced creativity. Television accelerated the decline. With cameras framing each play, trickery became harder to disguise. Fans demanded offense. Teams built playbooks to please. The hidden cerebral dimension of kicking its manipulation of geometry. Psychology and luck was too subtle for broadcast clarity. It was a victim of visibility. The hidden language of the kickers before specialization. Every player had to understand the geometry of the foot. Linemen knew the sound of a clean strike. Returners read, spin like a language. Quarterbacks could gauge hang time by ear. During practices, old coaches would make players listen, not look to kicks. Hear the angle, they'd say. The ball will tell you where it's going. This sensory literacy is gone from the modern game. Precision replaced intuition. But in the 1930s, when lighting was dim and the crowd close enough to smell sweat, that sound, the crack of leather against hide, was as thrilling as a touchdown pass. It wasn't just the foot meeting the ball. It was the pulse of strategy made audible. Kicking as philosophy, the pre-television game viewed space differently. Every yard mattered. Field position was not an analytic metric, it was emotional terrain. Coaches built entire philosophies around patience and control. A game could be won not by brilliance, but by refusal to err. A 35-yard punt that pinned an opponent deep could feel as heroic as a 60-yard run. That's what made tactical kicking so human. It existed in the realm between art and accident, where mastery meant understanding not just rules or technique, but context. As one coach wrote in 1947, the great kicker isn't just one who strikes true it, as the one who knows when not to. Epilogue: the final drop. When Doug Flutie drop-kicked an extra point for the New England Patriots in 2006, decades after anyone had tried it, wasn't just nostalgia. It was resurrection. For one brief instant, the crowd and the cameras glimpsed a lost world, when football was slower, wetter, and more uncertain. When strategy lived in the foot as much as the hand. The pre-television game was never just about brute strength or diagrammed plays. It was about intelligence in motion, the ability to adapt to mud, wind, and chance. And nowhere was that more evident than in the art of the kick. Because before the camera, before the crowd, before the codified spectacle, the game belonged to men who could turn chaos into control with nothing more than a ball, a bounce, and a perfectly timed strike. The locker room smelled of chalk dust and cold leather that morning. The players had gathered in silence, still wrapped in their coats against the December wind cutting through Chicago's north side. On the board, the coach drew 3 neat dots in a row, quarterback directly under center, 2 halfbacks behind, a fullback deeper still. It looked simple, almost childlike, until he began to move the chalk. Arrows curved outward. Motion lines swung behind the line. A fake here, a counter there. Then he turned and said quietly, "This is how we'll change football." The men in the room, George Hollis's 1940 Bears, sat motionless, trying to process what they'd just seen. For years, they had lived in the era of the single wing, where the snap traveled directly to the tailback and misdirection depended on chaos. But this T formation put the ball in one pair of hands, under center, and gave that man total control. They didn't yet know it, but they were looking at the blueprint of modern offense. The Shaughnessy revelation, the T formation, was not new. Variations had appeared in the late 19th century, when football still looked like a hybrid of rugby and military drill. But by the 1930s, it was Clark Shaughnessy, the eccentric Stanford coach with a mind like a mathematician, who breathed life into it again. Shaughnessy was obsessed with geometry. He believed that the problem with the single wing was not its power, but its inefficiency. Too many steps, too much time between snap and decision. His version of the T formation put the quarterback directly behind the center, cutting the exchange to a split second. From that anchor point, every option, handoff, fake pitch, or pass could unfold with identical rhythm. When Shaughnessy shared his findings with George Halas in 1939, the Bears coach recognized its potential immediately. Together, they refined a tatting motion, reversing line splits, and embedding deception into structure. By the time the 1940 NFL championship game arrived, the experiment was ready. The Washington Redskins had humiliated the Bears weeks earlier, mocking them as crybabies. Halas promised revenge. The result? A 73-0 demolition. The T formation's public baptism. Why the T worked? The T formation's genius lay in its symmetry. In the single wing, everything was off balance. Line splits heavy to one side. Backs staggered to create confusion. Defenses learned to key on these tendencies. But the T erased predictability. Every play started from identical structure. Defenders had to read, not guess. The direct snap to the quarterback meant faster exchanges, sharper fakes, and synchronized motion. The halfbacks could become receivers or decoys. The fullback could plunge straight ahead or sell a block and slip into open space. For the first time, football possessed the skeleton of modern play action. What Shaughnessy called split-second deception became the defining rhythm of post-war offense. It was not just about power, it was about timing. Every step, every pivot, every feint carried meaning. The Bears drilled it endlessly. George Halas later said, "Our goal was to make the defense think we could do anything from the same look." In that sentence lies the Dane of every modern playbook. The quarterback ascends before the tee. The quarterback was a glorified messenger, a handoff man, not a field general. But the new system placed the game in his hands. From under center, he could see both sides of the line. His ball fakes mattered as much as his arm. His cadence dictated motion. The position evolved from mechanical to cerebral. Sid Luckman, the Bears quarterback from Columbia University, became the prototype. Luckman wasn't the biggest or fastest, but he understood rhythm. He mastered the art of turning his back to the defense, hiding the ball behind his hip, and re-emerging to throw deep. Defenders couldn't find the ball. By the time they did, it was already gone. Luckman threw for 23 touchdowns in 1943, staggering number for that era and won for championships. Running Shaughnessy's version of the T in the process, he redefined what a quarterback could be. The play-action revolution, the T formation, didn't just change alignment, Sid changed psychology. By standardizing the start of every play, coaches could layer deception into timing. The same backfield motion could produce a dive, a counter, or a deep pass. Defenses were forced to hesitate. That hesitation was gold. The Bears turned it into an empire. Their linemen sold the run with perfect posture. Their backs moved in synchronized arcs. Laws later said, "We didn't invent trickery, we made it honest." The idea spread rapidly through college and pro ranks. Coaches like Paul Brown in Cleveland and Frank LaHaye at Notre Dame adapted it, refining the handoffs and integrating more sophisticated pass concepts. By 1946, the T formation was no longer an innovation. It was the language of football. The mechanics of motion. Shaughnessy's true masterstroke was motion. By sending a halfback in motion before the snap, the offense could expose defensive alignment. Was the corner following, zone, or man? The moving back could become a flanker, a decoy, or a surprise blocker. This constant shifting made defenses uncomfortable. It forced communication under pressure, a system that predated the modern pre-snap read. Halas's assistants joked that the Bears' practices looked like ballet rehearsals. Every player had to move with precision, never tipping the play. One wrong angle, one mistimed step, and the illusion collapsed. But when executed flawlessly, the T formation became visual poetry, motion and deception fused into inevitability. The College-Pro Exchange, the 1940s, marked an unusual moment of collaboration between college and pro football. College innovators like Shaughnessy, Frank LaHaye, and Don Foro experimented freely, while pros like Halas and Lambeau adapted selectively. The absence of television allowed ideas to spread by word of mouth, clinic, and playbook exchange. In those pre-media years, the divide between amateur and professional strategy was porous. Coaches attended each other's practices, shared diagrams, and occasionally stole them outright. But once television arrived, those channels closed. Pro teams became secretive, guarding terminology as intellectual property. College systems diversified into regional dialects. The open laboratory of the 1930s and 40s became a competitive marketplace. The T formation was the last universal language football would share before the camera fractured it. Humanizing the innovation, the T wasn't born from computers or committees, it came from men working late in locker rooms, scratching lines into chalkboards until the erasers wore thin. Halas and Shaughnessy were different in temperament, Halas, the pragmatist, Shaughnessy, the theorist, but they shared a belief that football was solvable. Not predictable, but solvable. Assistants told stories of Shaughnessy pacing in silence, murmuring to himself about space and angles. He'd sketch a play, pause, erase it, and start again. When Hollis brought those sketches to life on the field, it felt like alchemy. Players didn't always understand the diagrams, but they trusted the rhythm. They learned that if they followed it perfectly, the field would open like a curtain. And when it did, when a fake dive froze linebackers and a tight end slipped behind them for an untouched touchdown, it was as if time paused. The play itself became a revelation. The cultural shift, the T formation, didn't just modernize tactics. It transformed the sport's identity. Before it, football was closer to trench warfare mass formations, grinding runs, hidden ball plays. The T introduced grace, visibility, and rhythm. Spectators could now see the logic. Even radio announcers found it easier to describe. Quarterback under center. He fakes to the halfback, drops back, he's throwing. The game became more narrative, more cinematic, long before cameras arrived to capture it. In a sense, the T formation was pre-television's gift to television-y system that made football visually coherent. It created the framework that broadcasting would later magnify. But for the men who designed it, the transformation was deeply personal. They were no longer architects of secrecy. They were composers of movement, tactical symmetry, and the future once the T took hold. Innovation accelerated. Paul Brown built his Cleveland Browns dynasty on it, adding scripted plays, timing routes, and audibles. Sid Gilman later layered in vertical passing, turning geometry into aggression. The West Coast system, the spread, even the RPO all trace their ancestry to Shaughnessy's diagrams. The T formation's influence became invisible because it became assumed. Yet, its true genius lies in its simplicity. One quarterback, under center, reading the field. One symmetrical line, flexible in intent. One set of motions capable of infinite variation. Every modern offense, no matter how exotic, still begins with that fundamental logic. Disguise your intent, control your timing, manipulate space. Those principles were born in a cold Chicago locker room. Chalk dust rising like breath in winter air. The irony of progress: by the time television arrived in the 1950s, the T formation had already reshaped the sport. Ironically, the very formation that brought clarity to the field now made the game easier to broadcast. Camera crews could track plays. Commentators could predict structure. But with visibility came exposure. Teams could study televised games, freeze frames, and replicate success. The secrecy that once defined strategy began to erode. Hollis's system had conquered the league, but it had also opened the gates to mass observation. The play that once stunned a silent locker room became the standard vocabulary of football. Epilogue. The chalk that started it all. In later interviews, George Halas kept a single piece of chalk in his office drawer. He said it was from that 1940 meeting, the one where he drew the first T formation diagram that would change everything. He never used it again. It stayed there, worn and gray, like a relic from a vanished religion. For him, the T formation was more than a tactical shift. It was the moment when football stopped being improvised chaos and became organized intelligence. A bridge between instinct and design. Between the unseen and the televised. That chalk marked the first line of the T, was the line dividing old football from the modern world. The story of football's forgotten strategies doesn't end on the field, continues in archives, attics, and basements where the ghosts of playbooks whisper back into existence. Across the country, from the Pro Football Hall of Fame's research rooms to the quiet back corners of Midwestern libraries, a new generation of researchers, curators, and collectors has been engaged in a different kind of game: the pursuit of vanished knowledge. Their arena is the archive, and their opponents are time, mildew, and neglect. It often begins with a phone call or an estate sale listing. A retired coach passes away. His family uncovers a trunk of papers. Among yellowed clippings and old programs might sit a leather-bound notebook. Its spine cracked, its cover faintly embossed with the team's initials, long forgotten. Inside, a revelation. Diagrams written in pencil, arrows showing misdirection sweeps, defensive shifts annotated in shorthand, and cryptic notations like split T unbalanced, December 41. These rediscoveries are more than curiosities. They are archaeological finds in the language of strategy. One of the most remarkable examples came from an unassuming attic in Racine, Wisconsin, once home to one of the NFL's founding clubs. When a descendant of a 1920s assistant coach opened a box labeled Season 24, they found not only handwritten plays, but a letter describing the conditions under which the team practiced. The field was half frozen. We marked the ball spot with cinders. That letter, and the pages that followed, provided historians with direct evidence of how early teams adjusted formations to field conditions on organic, adaptive process mostly erased by the homogenization of modern turf. Archivists have since learned that much of early football's tactical record exists outside official collections. Small-town newspapers, for example, sometimes printed partial diagrams or brief coaching notes to explain how a local team's formation worked. In the absence of film, these snippets were both educational tools and marketing devices. Today, digital scanning projects like the Newspaper Archive and Chronicling America have allowed historians to piece together fragmented tactical genealogies. When viewed in sequence, the same play, say, a spinner reverse appears under different names and with subtle modifications, suggesting an informal national network of idea sharing before coaching clinics or televised games existed. The recovery of these fragments also reconfigures how we understand the lineage of innovation. Consider the so-called hidden punt, a maneuver thought to have originated in the 1930s. A playbook uncovered from a small college in Pennsylvania, dated 1925, shows nearly the same diagram, indicating that professional coaches may have absorbed ideas from semi-pro or regional college programs, not the other way around. Each rediscovered notebook therefore becomes a piece of evidence in a broader re-evaluation that early football was not merely the product of a few geniuses like Halas or Rockne, but a collaborative, decentralized experiment across hundreds of teams. At the heart of these discoveries are the people who preserve and interpret them. Librarians at Midwestern universities have become unlikely detectives, learning to recognize play diagrams by hand tailback circles, guard poles, and even the faint smudge of erased counters. Oral historians, too, have become part of this recovery, interviewing descendants of players who kept notebooks as training aids. A grandson might recall that his grandfather, once a lineman for a short-lived 1930s club, always carried a small ring-bound sketchbook, part diary, part manual. Inside, notations of games, scores, and sketches of line splits, each one a snapshot of tactical thought at the time. In one remarkable case, a researcher tracing the origins of the T formation discovered that Clark Shaughnessy's assistant had donated personal materials to a small California high school decades ago. The papers, largely overlooked, contained alternate versions of early T formation diagrams, including annotations on quarterback footwork and timing that differed from the canonical versions printed in coaching manuals. This find reshaped historians' understanding of how the T evolves not as a single, finished invention, but as a living, contested structure refined across multiple coaching circles. Equally vital are the institutions now curating these materials. The Pro Football Hall of Fame, the College Football Hall of Fame, and numerous regional museums have begun digitization projects to make fragile documents accessible to researchers. Playbooks from the 1930s, previously considered too brittle to handle, are now scanned in high resolution, revealing marginal notes, erasures, and even coffee stains that testify to their working nature. These are not sterile records but living documents, marked by the hands that wrote and revised them. Some of the most evocative discoveries are not written at all, but drawn on chalkboard photographs, fair glimpses of strategy in motion. In one 1940s image from a training camp, you can see a coach's hand mid-gesture, chalk dust rising as he draws a line through defenders. The photo captures not just a tactic, but a moment of instruction, the physical act of transferring knowledge from mind to board. It's the pre-digital equivalent of watching a film breakdown, and it reminds us that football's tactical life once depended entirely on memory, visualization, and repetition. The documentary's production team drew heavily on these archives. Access to team records in Canton, the Shaughnessy papers at Stanford, and digitized microfilms of 1930s newspapers provided the backbone of this reconstruction. When paired with oral history, some recorded in the 1970s from surviving players, the material reveals both continuity and loss. Plays that once dominated entire seasons have no surviving diagram. Others survive only because a player doodled them in the margins of a notebook decades later. But recovery is not nostalgia, it's revelation. As modern historians reassemble these fragments, they challenge the assumption that football's tactical sophistication began with television or modern analytics. Instead, they reveal an ecosystem of experimentation long before film study or national media. The rediscovered playbooks show that coaches understood spacing, leverage, and misdirection with remarkable nuance, even if their language was idiosyncratic. Where a 1930s diagram might label a route as banana, modern terminology would call it an outtend. The concept is the same. Only the vocabulary changed. These archival projects also expose the sociology of strategy, the networks through which knowledge flowed. Letters between coaches, discovered in family papers, reveal how ideas spread informally. One 1934 exchange between two Midwest coaches discussed a defensive alignment for dealing with a single wing, a formation they'd both seen but interpreted differently. Their correspondence shows the tension between secrecy and sharing, a dynamic that continues to define football's culture. In preserving and interpreting these documents, archivists perform a kind of resurrection. Each recovered play is a story reclaimed from silence, a fragment of a game once played before the lens of television standardized what the public could see. And while many of these plays will never be replicated on modern fields, their rediscovery deepens our sense of continuity. The hand-drawn arrow from a 1920s notebook and the digital route diagram in a modern analytics database are part of the same lineage of human curiosity, the desire to outthink, outmaneuver, and outcreate. Yet, even as we recover more, gaps remain. The transition to television, while preserving the game's visibility, also narrowed its remembered forms. Plays that were never filmed because they were deemed too old-fashioned or because teams refused to reveal them disappeared from public consciousness. Thus, the archivist's task becomes urgent, to find not just what was saved, but what was left out. For some researchers, this work has taken on the tone of detective fiction. Boxes mislabeled, notebooks split across estates, or a stray clipping revealing an unrecorded variant of a play. It is in these small recoveries that football's early strategic imagination reappears. What emerges is not a single narrative, but a mosaic wine, in which every recovered line and arrow contributes to the portrait of an evolving art form. This batch closes not on a field, but in the quiet hum of an archive reading room, fluorescent light on yellowed pages, pencil tracing an old diagram. The story of pre-television football, once scattered and fading, is being rebuilt play by play, page by page. What these materials reveal is not just forgotten strategies, but forgotten ways of thinking, modes of secrecy, creativity, an adaptation that remind us how much of the game still lies unseen beneath its modern surface. When football first met the microphone and camera, it wasn't strategy that led, it was business. The game that had once lived in mud, memory, and the chalk dust of locker rooms found itself illuminated under stadium lights, surrounded by sponsors, broadcasters, and producers who needed the sport to be understandable, repeatable, and marketable. What followed was not only a transformation of how fans experienced football, but also a profound re-engineering of what coaches could keep secret. The first signs appeared in the 1930s, when radio broadcasts became a weekly ritual across the Midwest. Local announcers turned tactical chess matches into stories of momentum and emotion. But that narration came with a cost. Nuance vanished in translation. The single wing's misdirection, the subtle shift of a pulling guard, or a defensive stunt meant to bait a backfield doll became a great run up the middle. For listeners, that was enough. For coaches, it was exposure. Teams realized that the more detailed the radio description, the more likely rival scouts could piece together tendencies. Some teams quietly asked announcers to generalize or misreport play types, a line plunge instead of an end around. Still, the commercial opportunity was irresistible. By the late 1930s, sponsorships had turned games into packaged entertainment. Companies like Old Gold cigarettes or Gillette began sponsoring halftime shows and pre-game segments, pushing the league to expand its broadcast footprint. The more the NFL depended on this money, the more it had to standardize its product. The league that once tolerated chaotic schedules and varied rules among teams now needed consistency both for audiences and advertisers. That consistency extended to how football was explained. As broadcasters sought to reach larger audiences unfamiliar with the sport's intricacies, they pressured teams to simplify their tactics. A play that looked identical on camera, whether a dive, trap, or draw, was easier to describe, easier to sell. Coaches who prided themselves on misdirection and formation subtlety now had to consider the camera's gaze. It was no longer enough to outsmart the opposing sideline. They also had to package the game for millions who had never played it. The turning point came in the 1940s, when experimental televised games hinted at a revolution. At first, coaches viewed television with suspicion. George Halas, ever the strategist, understood immediately that cameras could reveal too much. Every formation, every shift, every substitution, things once seen only by those inside the stadium would now be studied by anyone with access to a replay. "You can't hide from a camera," one coach remarked in a 1946 interview. "You can hide from a scout, but not from a lens." The economics were unrelenting. Television brought new sponsors, larger audiences, and the promise of national fame. To secure those contracts, owners and league officials made a quiet calculation. Secrecy was expendable. Visibility was revenue. Coaches who once hoarded their playbooks like state secrets were now asked to open the game up to produce more passing, more scoring, more moments of clear drama. The business of football began to dictate its style. One of the most revealing stories comes from the negotiations around early televised championship games. League representatives and broadcast executives debated where cameras could be placed. Coaches protested the installation of sideline cameras that could capture their signals. In one meeting recorded in league minutes, now archived in Canton, an owner asked whether the value of secrecy outweighed the value of the sponsor. The question went unanswered, but the outcome was clear. Broadcasts expanded, and tactical privacy shrank. For broadcasters, this visibility was not just a technical choice, but a narrative one. They needed to explain the game to sell it. Play diagrams began to appear in halftime programs. Announcers like Red Barber and later Chris Schenkel translated complex maneuvers into plain English. The more accessible football became, the faster its tactical dialects faded. A sport once defined by insider code signals tapped on shin pads, whispered terminology in huddles, was slowly being translated for mass consumption. The process was accelerated by the league's emerging partnership with sponsors who demanded predictability. Advertisers needed scheduled timeouts, commercial breaks, and halftime slots. These requirements shaped the rhythm of the game itself. Timeouts and stoppages, once purely tactical, were now moments of economic choreography. Coaches learned to sync their decision-making with broadcast windows. The field became not just a competitive space, but a stage designed for pacing, spectacle, and advertisement. By the early 1950s, this transformation was complete. The NFL's televised product had become a cultural fixture. But within locker rooms, unease simmered. Some coaches began withholding their most intricate plays from nationally televised games, saving them for crucial moments when scouting film would have less future impact. Others adopted coded variations adjusting motions or formations slightly so that plays appeared identical to the untrained eye but carried different reads. Secrecy had evolved, but its domain was shrinking fast. The new medium also changed the economics of reputation. Coaches and players who adapted to television's demands, those who played visibly, dramatically became stars. Tactical subtleties that didn't translate visually were marginalized. Offensive creativity shifted toward spectacle. Long passes, visible fakes, high-speed motion. The intricate blocking symphonies of the 1930s gave way to the camera-friendly vertical game of the 1950s. The shift wasn't only aesthetic, it was structural. The game itself was being rewritten by exposure. The financial rewards were undeniable. Television contracts brought stability and national reach that the league had never known. Attendance soared, merchandising exploded, and players' salaries began to rise. But the price was the loss of an older culture of tactical secrecy, a code of craftsmanship passed through handshakes, notebooks, and whispered terminology. Coaches who once viewed themselves as architects of secret knowledge were now public performers. The line between innovation and entertainment blurred. Even fan expectations changed. Once, a clever misdirection or obscure formation drew admiration from insiders who understood its difficulty. Now, fans wanted clarity. They wanted to see the ball, not the deception. Television rewarded transparency. Camera angles followed the quarterback, not the pulling guard. What couldn't be seen was edited out. Over time, broadcast norms rewired how audiences perceived strategy. What wasn't visible wasn't valuable. Yet, paradoxically, this exposure also fueled a new kind of secrecy film study. By the late 1950s, as television footage became widely available, teams began building their own archives of broadcast recordings. Coaches who once resented exposure now turned it to their advantage, dissecting opponents through the very medium that had made secrecy obsolete. The economy of exposure birthed an economy of surveillance. The shift was total. By the time the first full national television deal was signed in 1962, the NFL had become both a sport and a broadcast institution. The game's rhythms, the pauses, angles, and commentary were as engineered for the viewer as for the player. The earlier eras of hand-drawn secrecy, attic-kept notebooks, and oral transmissions seemed to belong to another civilization. What had been local and secret was now national and visible. And yet, when historians today trace the lineage of strategy, those lost decades remain the root system, the hidden foundation that nourished everything that followed. Every televised play still echoes the unseen rehearsals of the 1920s and 1930s, when coaches and players guarded their craft from public eyes. The paradox of football's evolution is that its survival required its exposure, even as that exposure eroded its most sacred traditions. The economics of visibility transformed football into America's preeminent spectator sport. But in doing so, it converted mystery into media, craft into content. What once existed as private innovation became public entertainment. And though television immortalized the game, it also drew the final curtain on the age of secrecy that had defined it. There's a moment deep in the archives when a page of yellowed paper catches the light and a single word stands out. Counter. A line drawn in faded pencil shows a pulling guard, a step of hesitation, a cutback into daylight. The date at the top reads 1932. The coach's name is long forgotten. But the concept of misdirection, of deceiving the defense by showing one thing and doing another, has survived a century. In that diagram lies the heart of football's evolution, the quiet endurance of certain ideas and the slow disappearance of others. When television arrived and football became a national spectacle, not every play could survive the transition. The game had to become legible to viewers and predictable to broadcasters. Plays that required chaos-crowded scrums, sleights of hand invisible to the camera faded into legend. What endured were those rooted in timeless geometry, adaptable to any rulebook or generation. Take For example, the simple dive. It's the oldest play in football, a straight line surge through the center, depending on timing, leverage, and force. In the 1920s, it was the spine of every offense. Today, in spread formations and zone schemes, its essence lives on as the inside zone or quick trap. The name changes, the principle remains. Some ideas are too fundamental to die, but others were fragile. The hidden ball play, a masterpiece of choreography where the ball vanished into a tangle of bodies, was once a staple of early football as misdirection. Newspapers in the 1920s delighted in describing its magic. A fullback who faked a fumble, a quarterback who slipped the ball under a teammate's jersey. Yet once the camera arrived, the illusion collapsed. Television demanded clarity. Rules tightened around ball handling to prevent trickery deemed unsportsmanlike. By the 1950s, the hidden ball play existed only in anecdotes, recalled with both reverence and disbelief. Certain formations, too, faced extinction. The single wing, once the ruling system of football, began its long fade after World War II. Its unbalanced lines and spinning backfields confused defenses in the days of still photography and limited scouting. But on film, its asymmetry was easy to diagnose. Defenses could watch the tailback's every move, trace pulling guards, and study tendencies that had once been invisible. By the time television regularized coverage angles, the single wing looked archaic, too deliberate, too slow, too exposed. Only a handful of high schools kept it alive, quietly passing its logic from one coach to another. Yet, even in disappearance, survival took root. Concepts from the single wing motion, unbalanced strength, direct snaps re-emerged decades later in the wildcat and spread offenses. What television killed, the future resurrected in disguise. Coaches who studied the past saw that every vanished idea left a fossil record, ready to be rediscovered when the game's conditions changed again. Not all losses were tactical. Some were cultural. Before the broadcast era, teams often devised plays unique to their region of formation that worked on muddy fields in Pennsylvania. A trick snap that exploited frozen turf in Wisconsin. Local identity was tactical identity. When national exposure came, uniformity followed. Standardized rules, schedules, and camera coverage left little room for regional flavor. Football's diversity of dialects was streamlined into a single, televised language. But there were survivors, coaches, and archivists who refused to let the old game vanish. Clark Shaughnessy kept meticulous notes on his pre-war experiments, filling thousands of pages with diagrams and annotations. George Halas preserved early Bears playbooks that mapped the transition from single wing to T formation. In small college libraries, forgotten assistants stored carbon copies of practice scripts. Their preservation wasn't romantic, it was practical. They saw knowledge as currency. Plays might fade from the field, but in the right hands, they could be reborn. The question of survival often came down to adaptability. Plays that relied on fixed conditions, ball shape, field texture, substitution rules, were brittle. The dropkick thrived when footballs were rounder, and rules allowed quick changes of possession. As the ball elongated and kicking style shifted toward the toe, the technique disappeared. The same fate met the quick kick. A surprise punt from scrimmage meant to flip field position. Television and modern analytics rendered it inefficient. But at its core, the idea of situational deception, the sudden change of expectation, remains alive in fake punts and surprise onside kicks. The DNA of the vanished plays lives on, scattered through modern schemes. Some disappearances were almost accidental. A generation of coaches retiring in the 1950s took their playbooks home, stored them in attics, and left them there. When their families cleaned out the houses decades later, many were discarded as clutter. The loss was immense. First-hand documentation of football's tactical adolescence. Yet a few escaped that fate. The Pro Football Hall of Fame now holds notebooks from Curly Lambeau, Greasy Neal, and other early architects, each a glimpse into a world before the playbook became a corporate artifact. The durability of football's core concepts speaks to an enduring truth. Strategy is not technology-bound. What changes is the medium through which it is transmitted. In the pre-television age, strategy was oral, secret, and local. In the broadcast age, it became visual, analyzed, and global. What remains is the same search for advantage, the same desire to disguise intention and impose will. The means evolve. The instincts endure. Consider the power sweep. Immortalized by Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers in the 1960s. At its heart, it's a single-wing concept pulling guards leading a ball carrier outside, with timing and precision creating space. Lombardi didn't invent it. He refined it, borrowing from a lineage that stretched back to Pop Warner. What he did differently was make it television-proof. The sweep was visible, elegant, and effective, a play that the audience could follow and analysts could praise. It survived because it satisfied both the competitive and the commercial demands of modern football. By contrast, plays that required invisibility couldn't adapt. The Spinner series, where the backfield pivoted and exchanged the ball multiple times, was designed to deceive nearby eyes, not distant cameras. Once broadcasts allowed viewers and opponents to study slow-motion replays, such plays became liabilities. Football's evolution wasn't just tactical, it was optical. The camera dictated survival as surely as any rulebook. There's also the matter of institutional memory. The NFL's early decades lacked formal archives. Newspapers recorded outcomes, not schematics. Only with the rise of coaching clinics, professional associations, and later, the film age did systematic knowledge transfer emerge. What we remember of early strategy is selective, shaped by which coaches left records and which were forgotten. Plays from underfunded teams, independent clubs, or minority leagues often vanished because their creators lacked access to preservation networks. The early black professional teams, for example, developed their own strategic nuances, speed-based misdirection. Multi-positional athletes that influenced regional play but left few written traces. Their disappearance is a silence that speaks volumes. Some vanished plays live on as rumor, described but never diagrammed. The Pennsylvania spread, the Ohio twist, the Texas trap. Names that appear in local newspapers or oral histories but have no surviving notation. They are ghost plays, evidence of a lost tactical vocabulary. When historians uncover partial diagrams or fragments of terminology, they reconstruct not only plays but worldviews, ways of thinking about football that predate its televised consolidation. The endurance of certain concepts also reveals football's inherent adaptability. Motion, misdirection, and spacing ideas present in 1920s sandlots now define modern playbooks. The spread offense, read option, and RPO's echo principles known to coaches a century ago. Every generation rediscovers them under new names, shaped by new conditions but guided by the same human instinct to deceive and outthink. Football, in this sense, never forgets completely. It only buries and resurrects. But it's worth asking, what was lost emotionally, not just tactically? The pre-television game thrived on intimacy, the shared secrecy between coach and player, the trust that a coded phrase or glance would carry meaning only to those inside the huddle. When the camera arrived, that intimacy dissolved into analysis. Plays became data, angles became metrics, and strategy became public property. The romance of hidden knowledge, the whispered signal, the improvised trick faded into the archives. Still, even today, when teams use virtual reality and AI to diagram tendencies, the same essence remains. Players searching for unseen edges, coaches protecting the slivers of mystery that still exist. The game, however illuminated, still hides within itself a dark room of creativity, a space where old plays whisper through modern schemes. In the end, the question isn't which plays disappeared, but what their disappearance reveals about the game itself. Football has always been a negotiation between secrecy and spectacle, innovation and exposure. The plays that endured were those that could survive in the light simple enough to be seen, deep enough to remain unpredictable. The ones that vanished belonged to a more private world, where strategy was craft, not content. The silent diagrams on yellowed pages, the half-erased chalk marks, the coded gestures passed between generations all remind us that football's story isn't only told on the screen. It's written in the invisible lineage of those who played before anyone was watching. There's a silence that settles at the end of a long investigation, a quiet recognition that the game I've been chasing no longer exists, at least not in the form it once took. The football of chalk and cinders, of coded language passed through locker rooms and sandlots, has become something else entirely. Yet the more I studied the forgotten diagrams, the brittle paper, the fading pencil marks, the more I realized the story of football's lost plays isn't really about what vanished. It's about what we choose to remember and why remembering still matters. From the very beginning, this journey was about secrecy. The early NFL, before the networks, before the floodlights, was built on concealment. Plays were guarded like family heirlooms, strategies shared only among those who had earned the right to know. It was a world of trust and quiet rivalry, where innovation came not from corporate research, but from intuition and the lived experience of men who worked day jobs and coached by night. That secrecy was the game's Soviet's dark current of invention. Then came exposure. Cameras, slow motion, commentary, analytics. Football became not just a sport, but a broadcast spectacle shaped for viewers rather than for those who played it. The transition to mass media did more than amplify the game. It redefined it. What had once been a local dialect turned into a national language, its grammar standardized by television producers and league officials. Plays that couldn't be captured on film disappeared. Coaches who thrived in ambiguity lost their advantage. The creative ecosystem that had fueled football's first half-century was replaced by something cleaner, brighter, and perhaps inevitably less personal. Yet even as I mourned that loss, I can't ignore what was gained. The spread of football through television created a shared cultural vocabulary, uniting cities and generations. It made possible the safety reforms that saved lives, the standardization that allowed athletes from different regions to compete on equal terms. The film age ushered in accountability, no more blind spots, no more silent injuries dismissed as toughness. Television, for all its flattening power, democratized the game. It gave every fan a seat on the 50-yard line. It turned a regional curiosity into America's defining sport. Still, the trade came with a cost that can't be measured in ratings or rulebooks. The cost was human, the loss of craft, the erasure of memory. In the early years, the game was an oral tradition, passed from coach to player in stories, gestures, and shared secrets. When those men died, so did their versions of football. Many of them never wrote down what they knew. They assumed their apprentices would carry it forward, not realizing that film and broadcast would soon make their knowledge obsolete. When I spoke with modern coaches who still use fragments of those old systems, direct snaps, deceptive blocking angles, single-wing footwork, they all said the same thing. We had to learn it from someone who remembered. That phrase, someone who remembered, became the heartbeat of this project. In archives and university basements, I found the last traces of those memories. A grease-stained notebook belonging to a 1930s assistant coach. A series of telegrams between small college teams negotiating practice sessions. Hand-drawn diagrams with cryptic labels like ghost, left, and reverse buck. Each was a piece of an extinct language. Some were crude, others brilliant. All were human. What struck me most was not the sophistication of the plays, but the humility of the process. These early innovators weren't chasing glory or sponsorships. They were solving problems. How do you move a ball 10 yards against 11 men trying to stop you? How do you turn confusion into space? Each line of chalk on those old boards represented an act of imagination, often born in isolation and necessity. When I compared those sketches to modern playbooks, digitized, color-coded, optimized for motion, analysis, I saw the same hunger beneath the surface. The difference wasn't intelligence, it was intimacy. The early game required knowing your players, not as data points, but as temperaments, as people. That intimacy is what I find myself mourning most. In the pre-television era, football was communal, almost artisanal. A coach's success depended on his ability to understand the quirks of his players, the conditions of his field, the rhythm of his community. The modern game, with all its precision, has lost some of that texture. We know more, but we feel less. Our understanding is sharper, but our connection is thinner. Still, the old spirit survives in flickers. I see it in the way high school coaches resurrect single-wing principles to confuse bigger opponents. I hear it in the way analysts describe the new RPO's run-pass options that are, in truth, century-old concepts reborn. The language evolves, but the thought remains. Football, even at its most commercialized, still hides traces of the old alchemy. You can feel it in the moments when a play breaks free of its design, when instinct overrules structure, and the game remembers itself. I often think about the coaches who saved a single play from extinction, the ones who couldn't let go. There was a small college in Ohio that kept running the double wing decades after the pros abandoned it. A high school in Tennessee that preserved the spinner series long enough for a curious assistant to rediscover it in the 1990s. Each act of preservation was an act of defiance, a refusal to let innovation be erased by convenience. These weren't museum curators, they were caretakers of living knowledge. Their quiet stubbornness ensured that football's tactical DNA remained more diverse than its television image suggested. The deeper I went into the archives, the more I realized that every lost play tells a story, not just of tactics, but of people. A guard who invented a blocking angle after watching factory machines. A quarterback who adapted a baseball slide into a rollout technique. A coach who scribbled plays on ration paper during wartime. None of these stories made it onto highlight reels. They weren't built for spectacle, but they shaped the game's soul. That's why preservation matters, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. Every modern innovation stands on a buried foundation. When we lose track of that foundation, we risk mistaking novelty for genius. The real genius lies in continuity. In seeing how an idea from 1924 still breathes inside a play called from an iPad in 2025. History doesn't hold us back, it deepens us. It reminds us that strategy, at its best, is not invention ex nihilo, it's conversation across generations. There's also a moral dimension to recovery. The early NFL, like the nation around it, was uneven in whose voices it amplified. Many black coaches, players, and innovators worked in parallel systems, the Negro leagues of football that rarely left written records. Their strategies, often more improvisational and open-structured, were absorbed later without credit. To recover the forgotten plays is, in part, to recover those lost lineages. Every rediscovered diagram or oral recollection is an act of just as a restoration of creative authorship long denied. In a time when the sport faces new transformations, rule changes, AI-driven analytics, global expansion, the lessons of the pre-television era feel urgent again. Technology will always redefine the field, but the human imagination remains the engine. The best modern coaches are archivists as much as tacticians. They study what came before, not to replicate it, but to understand how the game breathes. When I asked one current NFL assistant what he learned from watching silent era footage, he said, they weren't playing football, they were inventing football. Every down. That, I think, is the spirit worth carrying forward. The future of the game may depend on how well we remember its past. If television once narrowed football's field of vision, the digital age gives us a chance to widen it again. We can archive, restore, and share those old blueprints at a scale the pioneers could never imagine. The challenge is to approach that task, not as content creators, but as custodians, to treat each rediscovered play not as trivia, but as testimony. Every smudged line on paper is a window into human creativity under constraint. And so I come back to that yellowed page from 1932, the one labeled Counter. It's a simple play, almost ordinary now. But when I trace the pencil lines with my finger, I feel the presence of the man who drew them. I imagine him standing on a muddy field, explaining the steps to a group of players who probably worked factory shifts before practice. He didn't know his design would survive. He wasn't thinking about legacy. He was trying to solve a problem, to win a game. And in doing so, he left behind a fragment of genius that outlived him. I've spent years piecing together those fragments, trying to understand not just how the game changed, but what it meant to those who built it in obscurity. What I've found is both sobering and beautiful. A history of vanished brilliance, yes, but also of endurance of ideas too strong to die. Football before television was imperfect, violent, and deeply human. Its plays were flawed, its rules inconsistent, its heroes anonymous. But within that imperfection was a kind of freedom we rarely see today, the freedom to imagine without an audience. As I close this journey, I find myself haunted less by what's been lost than by what remains waiting to be rediscovered. Somewhere, in an attic or a forgotten folder, lies another play that once brought a stadium to its feet. Someone will find it. Someone will remember. And when they do, the Game Hour game will take one more breath of its oldest, truest self.